Good evening and welcome to the Tally Room live coverage of the 2026 South Australian state election. Tonight we're going to be with you for the next 3.5 hours going through what is happening in South Australia as we start to get results. I can see now that we're starting to get people replying to the chat. And thank you everyone for joining. So what we're going to be doing tonight is I'm going to have a series of guests coming in, kind of one every half hour roughly. Anthony Zugris at 7 o'clock, Josh Slimman at 7:30. We've got Jill Shepherd, Kevin Bonham, and Rob Manwaring also coming on later tonight. It's a bit of an experiment. We're just going to see how it goes over the night. And, I think people are probably looking for something a bit different from the typical kind of politician interviews. So that's what we're going to be trying to deliver tonight. Now, it's 7 o'clock in the East Coast. It's 6:30 p.m. now in South Australia. As it's not surprising, we don't really have any data yet for any of the seats. Tonight, where I need to be looking at results, I'm probably going to be using Poll Bludger's results summary service, which I'll drop this in the chat if anyone else wants to follow along. William Bowe, Poll Bludger, does a great service that is particularly useful for those of us who want to get the hard numbers. It's maybe not quite as user-friendly as the ABC one, but it's much more directed at people who want to be able to do the analysis themselves. And so as the night goes on, sometimes I might share a little bit of that. We're not going to be doing any particularly fancy graphics. It's a bit of an experiment. And, if people like it, we can make it more sophisticated for future elections. Now, I might go through a little bit of what we've known up until today. I'm just going to try and share an image, which will be up in a second, which will give us a bit of a sense of the what's been going on in terms of the polls. Sorry, this doesn't seem to be working. That's all right. So we've had a bunch of polls in the last week, and they all tell a pretty similar story. The Resolve poll, a little bit different. That was a bit of an experiment that they were running using AI calling. But all of the other ones are showing Labor in the high 30s. We got 37 in Demos, 38 YouGov and Fox and Hedgehog, News poll on 40. Roy Morgan, again, a little bit of an older poll from February, has Labor a bit lower on 35%. Every single poll we've seen has One Nation ahead of the Liberal Party. Some of them not by very much, some of them by more. Most of the four polls that I think are the most conventional polls we've gotten this week all have them between 21 and 23%, with the Liberal Party between 16 and 19%. Interestingly, the Resolve AI poll that they conducted has Labor further down, Liberals about the same as where they were, and One Nation on 28%. Let me just try a different way of sharing this graphic because we're going to need to share screens tonight to be able to see the graphics. This one here, this graphic is from 6 News, who are doing their own coverage, big fans of 6 News, and they've done this really nice graphic here showing all of the polls and comparing them to the last election. So the story is pretty consistent. The Greens up slightly, but honestly pretty similar to last time. One Nation ahead of the Liberal Party. So if this was to come true at an election, I think we would expect to see the Liberal Party in a very severe position. Labor, Labor's not particularly up, but I think the more divided right-wing vote will mean that on a two-party preferred basis in those conventional Labor-Liberal contests, I think Labor will be up a little bit. I expect that Labor would probably win some extra seats on these numbers. But then in their heartland, there would be Liberal versus One Nation contests. If the Liberals are hit particularly hard, they might even fall into third place. And at this point, I will take that off the screen. I'm just having a look at the chat as we go through, just to keep an eye on that. This is where preferences come into things. come into the story that we don't know a lot about how preferences will flow if One Nation is in the top two. At the last federal election, we only had 2 seats where that happened. One against the coalition, that was Maranoa, David Littleproud's seat, and one against Labor, that was Hunter, where in New South Wales. So in both cases, we in the case where it is a coalition versus One Nation contest, which in the case of South Australia means Liberal versus One Nation contest, we think Labor preferences probably will split roughly 50-50. There'll be a certain kind of Labor voter who prefers the Liberal Party, maybe boosted by the fact that the Liberal Party has received Labor's preferences. We're not showing any graphics right now. We're not. Someone was just commenting saying graphics not showing. We don't have any. We're not necessarily going to have graphics all night. This is pretty low tech first attempt that we'll do, and we can have graphics later. So if it's Liberal versus One Nation, I would expect to see the. If it's Liberal versus One Nation, I would expect to see Labor preferences split kind of roughly equally and not particularly strongly favour one side or the other. And so if that happens, I would expect that the, One Nation could win some of those races, but they wouldn't be in a very strong position. Where they really will have their best chances of winning are when the Liberals fall into third place, because the Liberal Party has preferenced One Nation over Labor, and thus it gives them a chance to come through and win from behind. So it will matter a lot, the order of elimination. To give you a comparison, the Greens were able to win the seat of Ryan, where Labor fell into third place, but they were not able to win the seat of Griffith, where the Greens' primary vote was higher, but they were in a contest against Labor. So it's this kind of mirror image here, where the major party that's closer to them, if they're able to push them into third place, it gives them a better chance of winning. So that's where the story stands in terms of preferences. Again, there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we might not find out tonight. We are hoping, so the Electoral Commission of South Australia will conduct tonight in every seat. They will do a primary vote count, and then they will do a 2-candidate preferred count between 2 candidates. But they've already chosen the order of those candidates before tonight. They may have decided to be conservative and just pick the candidates who came in the top 2 last time. But when it's very obvious, they may instead choose to put someone else into that top 2. And that's the order they're going to do. Even if it becomes clear at 8 o'clock that that's the wrong order, they're going to proceed with it. Now, it might be up to them whether they stop doing that count or whether they keep going, but they're not going to be in a position to change it and do a fresh count on the night, because every booth will have its instructions and they will proceed with those instructions. Now, if it's really clear they've got the wrong 2-candidate preferred count, they can start, I would suspect on Monday, we'll find that out maybe later tonight, they can start a different count. Where it gets really messy is where even on primary votes, we don't know who that top 2 is. And that's where we get into the question of 3-candidate preferred counts, which is something that the Australian Electoral Commission has started doing. And, we've even had seats where that isn't even enough. So until recently, if you ever had situations like that, and they were pretty rare, where it wasn't clear who the top 2 were going to be, you just waited until every vote had been counted, and then you went to a preferential count, a full distribution of preferences, the thing you would have learnt about in primary school, where you knock out candidates one by one. But the AEC has now started doing these 3-candidate preferred counts, which often speed things up. I'm not aware of any state that's ever done that, though. So I wouldn't expect we would get those from EXA, which is the Electoral Commission of South Australia, but we'll have to see. Now, we should talk a little bit about what the results of the last election were as well, because Labor had been in power in South Australia from 2002 till 2018. That's 16 years, 4 terms. They lost power that year to Stephen Marshall's Liberal Party. It wasn't a devastating loss, though. It was one of these ones where the party kind of held itself together. But what has happened since then is that party was only in power for 1 term. At the last election, Peter Malinauskas brought Labor back to power. And the result of that election was 27 seats for Labor, 16 for the Liberal Party, 4 independents, 2. And then since that election, Labor has gained 2 seats of by-elections. They were both seats held by former Liberal Party leaders. First of all, they won the seat of Dunstan, which belonged to Stephen Marshall. It was always a very marginal seat. So it was a surprise, but it wasn't a huge shock. And then they won the seat of Black when David Spears resigned. And David Spears had some scandals affecting him, mostly ones that hit after he had lost the leadership. And that was a traditional safe Liberal seat that Labor won. So Labor is coming into tonight with 29 seats. The Liberal Party actually has 13 incumbent MPs, but one of those is someone who became an independent. So for our purposes, we count that still as a Liberal seat, but they effectively have 14 seats, and then there are the 4 independents. Now, I'm going to take a break for a minute to check a few things, and then I will come back shortly. And in about 20 minutes, we'll have our first guest. Right now, before I go, though, we're just going to check some results. I've seen some reports saying that the South Australian Electoral Commission website is not working its results. So let's pull that up now and just check whether there's anything there to look at. Part of what is interesting about doing this is that you know, when you're an analyst on the radio, which I've done before, or you're doing it on TV, you're sharing the time with other journalists and interviews and things like that. We don't have that here, so there might be a few times where I take a pause for a bit, or just, you know, stop to check the chat. So I might just go through now. And yeah, there are comments saying that there are no results yet, literally no booths reporting. And it does seem to me like I'm not able to get the EXA website loading. There is one person in the comments, just to be clear, we don't have any results yet. So as soon as we have results, we'll be reporting some. Yeah, so there's a question there from someone about the electoral system of South Australia. It's pretty similar to most other lower house around the country, what might be called the alternative vote, or we often just call it preferential voting. Single member electorates, there's 47 seats. I'm just going to pull up, it is far too early to say, Michael, there's a comment there. I'm just going to pull up the electoral map of the state. Here we go. So there are 47 seats in South Australia, and each of them elects a single person. And when voters go in to vote, they're required to number every preference on their ballot paper. Candidates are knocked out until you end up with a final 2. Now, most of that is pretty much the same as the federal system, or the system in most other lower houses around the country: Queensland, Victoria, the Northern Territory, Western Australia. Where the difference lies, it's a pretty subtle one, which is that they have a system of voting tickets in South Australia that means that if a voter fills in part of their ballot, their vote can be counted as long as it matches, up until the point where they stop filling it in, as long as it matches one of the party's tickets. So if you vote 1 for the Greens and their second preference is for Labor, and you do a 1-2 for Greens then Labor, effectively what will happen is they will count that vote according to the Greens ticket all the way through, which is presumably the same as their how to vote card, but it could theoretically be different. If, on the other hand, if you were to go 1 Greens, 2 Liberal, that would not be counted. That would be informal. And if it was a 1 Green on its own, again, it would be counted according to the ticket. So it is something that reduces the level of informality. I think theoretically that may also mean that the fact that the One Nation has not directed preferences on their how to vote card might make things easy, the ticket system might reduce the level of informality that might otherwise cause. Because if voters look at that and they get confused and they only number a 1, it will follow the One Nation how to vote. All right, we're going to take a break for a few minutes. I will be, I'll probably just leave that up on the screen for a bit. We'll check if there's any results and just tweak a few things here. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining me, and I'll be back in a minute. Hello. Just coming back for a bit. We are still waiting. There's no results in yet. So I will put something up on the screen to say that as well. What we are that should sorry everyone. Just make it so that stays there. So we are cool. Yeah, so we're still waiting for the results to come in. I'm ready for we'll have our first guest soon. One other thing that it's worth talking about is that there has been a big change in how early voting has worked in South Australia compared to in the past in South Australia, and bring it into line with the rest of the country, which is that prior to this election, South Australia still required voters to have a reason to vote pre-poll. There was still a large number of people who did vote pre-poll, but in theory, you did still need to have a reason. What has happened this election is they have expanded the number of pre-poll booths, and they've made it so you don't need a reason. It's considered equal to election day, and that has caused an enormous increase in the number of pre-poll votes. We've now got 35% of people having voted at pre-poll. And so I think what we're going to see tonight is we're going to see a lot of the election day votes come in, and then we're going to have a pause. We're going to have a bit of a break for a little while. And then once those votes get counted, they're going to take longer to count because they're just in bigger booths. And then we'll start to get those votes coming in a bit later. Now, I'm going to invite Anthony to join us now. So please welcome. Let's see how quickly this works. Hello, Anthony. Can you hear me?
Hey Ben, can you hear me?
I can. Let me just see if I can just fix the volume to.
I can put myself down a bit if you need.
No. It's fine. It's fine. Yeah, if people can let us know about the relative volumes of ours and how they're sounding, as I'm sure you can tell, we don't have producers right now. It's just us doing it. So Anthony, we got a few questions on the Discord. We're not getting any results in yet about some big moments in South Australian political history. Why don't we start actually by looking just a few years ago at the 2018 state election, when SA Best were the big story, you know, that they were polling very high. There were times where they were polling equivalent to the two major parties. Nick Xenophon was doing very well in the two-party preferred vote. You know, he had done remarkably well in federal politics over the last decade. And then what happened when it came time for the actual election results on that night?
Well, I think what we saw there was that in the end, they didn't pan out enough for Nick Xenophon. I think he certainly got a swing. What it was 14-15%. That was, I mean, quite good for a party that was essentially contesting for the first time. But obviously, it wasn't enough to dethrone Labor or Liberal in the seats that Xenophon would have wanted. I think I've talked to a few people recently about this. If the swing was a bit larger, maybe 16-17%, we might have seen SA Best do a lot better, get a few more seats, push in a few more areas. But that was also at an election where the parties were equally matched. Looking at Labor and Liberal, they were quite evenly matched there. So there was a lot in it. And so, especially for Xenophon losing, Hartley, for instance, not managing to gain that seat. So, I think if we're looking at back then, it was a lot, but it just wasn't enough. And I think if we're looking towards today with One Nation, I think we may very well see similar in a lot of seats.
Now, we've seen a few reports saying we're getting a bit of results data. I haven't been able to find anything myself. The ABC website, the Poll Bludger website still are on zero, but there's been some reporting about there being a handful of seats called for Labor. But we will come back to that shortly. Yeah, part of the thing in 2018, I think, was that, it was partly that their vote was lower than what people had expected before the election. I think it was like 13-14%, something around that. But it was also that the vote was very even. And so it wasn't very concentrated, which I think might be a thing that would help One Nation. You know, the National Party wins a bunch of seats in federal elections on a much lower vote than 13%, and they still win seats. So that's going to be a big thing that we're going to want to watch with One Nation tonight is their vote really concentrated in those regions where they're more likely to win seats, there was a Demos poll, I think, that I was looking at that had them on like 15% in inner city Adelaide, where they're not going to win any seats, which would suggest some skew, but nowhere near as much of a skew. Now, if they're polling 23%, that's probably still putting them in a different range. But I think it is conceivable that we could see them, still polling very well, but getting a bit of a dialing back on their vote.
Yeah, definitely agree there. And I think with the One Nation vote, it's going to become very seat dependent. I think we're going to have to look at how swings towards Labour look, swings towards independents in a few of those seats look, to see if One Nation really does manage to break through in certain areas. So I think we're kind of, look, it'll be very, very seat dependent in places.
Yeah. Now, we're still not seeing any actual data coming through. We're still seeing 0.0% counted on the ABC.
Yeah, I think this happens every election where the ABC TV broadcast has seats confirmed, but then there's nothing online that tells you for a few minutes
so at the moment, look, we all know that Labor's the favourite in this election. We're not seeing any real data yet. But that is where we're at. I think probably soon we're going to start seeing some. I mean, it's almost 7 o'clock in South Australia now, so the counters have had about an hour to get going now. I tell you what, while we're still waiting for results, if anyone in the comments or anyone in the Discord wants to ask any questions, we might have time for one or two that you and I can go through, Anthony. But while we wait for those, the other one that was coming up a lot was a lot older history, which is about the Playmander. That, this thing is not unique to South Australia. It's also famously something that happened in Queensland, and it happened a little bit everywhere, which was malapportionment, the designing of electorates to make it so that regional voters their votes were worth more, and so that when the Liberal and Country League, which Thomas Playford led, was able to win elections despite Labor often getting more of the vote.
So I mean, that was a major thing, obviously, all the way up until the real Dunstan and Playford rivalry we see in the 50s, 60s going on there. There's still a leftover feel, I guess, of that Playmander. Obviously, the Playmander doesn't exist anymore, but there's always talk about certain seats having more or less worth, about there being a Labour-based Playmander that kind of exists in more urban seats these days. They're not really true, but there's a legacy there that really feels in. And I think when we look back at it, it really held the state it kind of by its claws. I mean, Playford by far is the longest running premier we've ever had. And I don't think, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, he's the longest leader in Australian history, elected leader in Australian history. It's like, I believe him and Menzies are quite close there. And so, yeah, the Playmander is remembered a lot because of how long it held him specifically.
We've got a few questions here, but before we go through them, I wanted to say something as well about pre-poll, which is one of the things that's changed with pre-poll is it's now only 1 week long, which we're seeing a lot of this all around the country, where the period of pre-poll has been shrinking. But most of the people who vote at pre-poll vote in the last few days. So I think people sometimes imagine that there's this enormous army of people voting 2 weeks out from election day. But that's not what's happening. Like, the people are mostly voting in the last couple of days. And, maybe if you have any thoughts on that, Anthony, I might pull up, there's a great graph on this from Anthony Green, talking about these pre-poll numbers that I'll go to find.
Definitely. I think, when we look at pre-polls and how it was, it is very interesting to look at. In SA, certainly, I've certainly seen and felt this increase in pre-polling. But today, when I went to vote, because I love voting on the day, I love the pageantry of it all. It was definitely a lot quieter in my booth than in previous elections, and I think that's partially down to the pre-polling, but I almost certainly agree with the fact that, yes, people are pre-polling later and later into the week. People aren't going to go really on a Monday or a Tuesday or even that Saturday and vote, but I know a lot of people, and I've seen a lot of people go for that Wednesday, Thursday area, and even Friday.
So this graph here, and you can find this if you go to Anthony Green's website, very useful kind of thing that I've done some elections but haven't really done for this one. If you look at 2022, it's this steady increase, a percentage or here or there per day, and then it really accelerates in the final week. This time there is a bit of an acceleration, but it's much less so because I think a lot of those people who would have voted in the second last week of the campaign have been moving up their schedule. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm interested what you think about this because I think there's a case to be made about not having people vote weeks out. But I also think largely if people have already made their mind up, and, parties could, they have the choice to make their announcements earlier. I think one of the concerns you often get is that people will be like, oh, well, there might be some big news that hits on the Thursday afternoon or whatever, and you've already cast your vote. But that's also true that news could hit on the Sunday, And
Yep.
so I think as long as it's not too far in advance, I wouldn't mind if most people voted pre-poll. I think it raises issues for how the count works, which we can talk about in a minute. But, what are your thoughts?
I almost certainly, I pretty much agree with everything there. I think people pre-polling is great. I think giving that flexibility to get more people engaging with the elections and democracy is excellent. But also, and I understand the issues around counting on that, but I don't think that's something that can be obviously mitigated with forward planning. Looking at policy announcements, like you said, there's something the parties choose to announce later. No parties going into the last week with something with new policy being prepared that last week. Those are policies they've had prepared weeks in advance and are strategically choosing to announce. So really, that's more just the parties needing to engage in a certain way with this new way people are voting.
Okay, so we are now getting the first data coming through.
Excellent.
It's very small. We've got less than 3,000 formal votes being cast. William's website is showing us a bunch of early numbers here. As you can see, there are a few places where they've got One Nation ahead. We might start with some of the ones that are relatively large number of voters. Chafee, as Josh mentioned on our last podcast, Chafee as being one to watch. Now, again, we're talking really small numbers of voters. Again, we've got a Liberal versus One Nation two-party count, the two candidate preferred count that they're doing in Chafee, showing the Liberal Party winning in the first booth. But we've got three small booths in. You've got One Nation on 34%, Liberals on 37%, Labor on 13%. And right now, Williams' model is projecting quite a close result. Liberals ahead, but, that looks competitive to me.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I on my predictions last night stated that I think the Sovereign Republic of Tim Whetstone would hold. I think it would require a pretty decent swing to have him lose out there. But it is looking quite close. Obviously, these are early numbers, and as Anthony Green always said when he was on ABC, it doesn't. They don't always tell the full story. So it'll be interesting to see how they continue to go throughout the rest of the night.
Now, I'm trying to pick the seats that have more than just one tiny booth because there are some where you've got that. It does look like maybe something was going on with the EXA feed that has taken a little while to start loading. So it may be that, some of these booths actually were ready 20 minutes ago, but now we're getting the data. Flinders, we have three booths in Flinders, Liberals on 34, One Nation's on 24, and Labor is on 4. So Flinders, tell us a little bit about Flinders.
Flinders is probably one of the most rural seats we have in South Australia, looking over to that Eyre Peninsula area. It's got a lot of candidates, as you can see right there. 3 independents and a bunch of different ones, including one of the only Nationals minor party candidates. So they're going to take a lot of space up at that bottom area. They'll be cannibalizing votes from themselves, but also from like parties like One Nation as well. There's a people who will be primarying in different areas there. Obviously, preferencing will fix that for someone like One Nation, but it does change that a bit.
Now I should note here, they are doing a two candidate preferred count between the Liberal and the independent Megan Petherick. So again, they're not necessarily choosing to do Liberal versus Labor, but there are no booths where that has officially reported. So I think this is some kind of estimate by William. But it doesn't look like that's going to happen unless things change. She's on 5.9%. This looks like a Liberal One Nation race. It is interesting that he has this as One Nation winning, because they are behind quite substantially, like 10%. You know, no one's calling anything, but I would look at that and go, I don't know if One Nation can catch up to the Liberals. And this is where, if we had a large quantity of experience of what it looks like when a Liberal and One Nation compete, that might tell us something, but we don't have that here.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I wasn't big on Petherick throughout this entire campaign. I don't think she's run that visible of a campaign, isn't that well known of an independent. So I don't. If the ECSA is pushing her as the Liberal versus Independent, I can't really see it happening. I definitely think this is either a Liberal versus One Nation or a Liberal versus Labour seat, depending on how the rest of the night pans out. And it's definitely looking like Liberal versus One Nation at this current moment.
Apparently, according to Seamus on the Discord, there are booths reporting 2CP there, but they're not showing up on Williams' reporting there. Now, if we go back to the front page, let's look at the swings a little bit. One Nation is up 23%, but you would expect on these. Oh, sorry, we're on Chafee here. If we go back to the statewide figures, One Nation is up 21%. They're on 24. It's looking a bit like what we saw in the polls. And the Liberals are down 15%, 16, almost 16%. Labor is also down a bit too. Now, these swings would be based on the booths that have come in, but still, this is mostly regional areas we're looking at here. Again, the Greens are up a little bit, which again is what the polls predicted. And at the moment, Williams' system has Labor ahead in 8, Liberal ahead in 3, One Nation ahead in 3. I will, as the night goes on, try and go through seats and say this is my take on who's going to win them. But right now, these numbers all look pretty small.
Lee's the biggest one right now.
Yeah, let's look at Lee. So yeah, Greens make the 2CP on these calculate. Oh, huh. Okay, so Lee, tell us about Lee. It's a fairly safe Labor seat by my reckoning, by my memory.
Yes, yes. It has had the issue that Stephen Mulligan was retired, so this is David Wilkins coming in as a replacement candidate for him. So that is the interesting thing. I've been spending a lot of time wondering if he would succeed quite well. Looks like he is so far. He's been very active presence in this area. Very, very active presence. Every day he's out doing stuff, doing things. So he's gotten his name out really well in this area, and you can see this. It'll probably translate to him winning.
Yeah. Now, I think this is an example of a seat where Labor's going to win comfortably. But if you look at these numbers here, Liberals are in 4th place on 7%, and that is off one booth reported, Semaphore Park South. Now things might be different elsewhere, but that's remarkable for the Liberal Party into 4th place. Look, I'm not going to call this seat right now, but I think they are likely to be in a position to win that seat. Sorry, I should make that a bit clearer. I'm just trying to find my spreadsheet that I've been using to track this stuff. But Lee is looking pretty solid for Labor right now. We wouldn't call it on one booth, but I think Labor will easily retain that seat. But it is again one where we're not going to get a valid 2-candidate preferred count tonight because they've got Labor versus Liberal as the 2-candidate preferred count, whereas this will probably end up as a Labor versus One Nation seat.
Yeah. We're getting a lot of flows in from results right now. I will say, Chafee is now up to 2.4%. I just saw West Torrens with 4.3, but that seat's essentially a non-starter in terms of analysis. As long as Tom Koutsantonis lives and chooses to run in that seat, that seat will be Tom Koutsantonis's. The people of West Torrens love him.
Okay, cool. Now, someone was pointing out Flinders. There was no One Nation candidate in Flinders last time, which is which still it's
Yeah.
interesting. Now let's just go through some of the others here. Adelaide, Labor and Liberal are quite competitive on the primary votes here. But that is a big fall for the Liberal Party. Part of what's happened here, Kieran Snape, who I
Yes.
believe was a former Greens candidate, is doing respectably there, 6%. And the Greens vote has only gone down a little bit despite effectively having two Greens-ish candidates in the race. This is the seat where I think it's pronounced Ao Baxter, the One Nation candidate,
Yep.
has had this scandal in the last few days around criminal charges that he's facing in the UK. This will be a pretty conventional two-horse race between Labor and Liberal. And,
Yep.
the projections are that Labor will win pretty comfortably.
Yep. Yeah, the only way I could see anything changing there is if Snape somehow managed to leapfrog both One Nation and the Greens.
No, yeah.
I still don't think he would beat the Liberals, but he might end up somewhere a lot higher than you'd expect. But I don't think. Besides that, I think it'll be pretty straightforward.
Now, on recommendation, we're looking at Narunga. Now, in Narunga, we've got the Liberal Party on 26%, and we've got Chantel Thomas from One Nation way ahead on 38%. That's off 4 booths reporting. Four would be a lot in a city electorate, but in the country, it's not that high a proportion. Narunga is one of those regional seats. And Fraser Ellis is the sitting Liberal MP, sitting independent MP who's a former Liberal. Remind us about him.
I'm gonna have to refresh myself because he's a bit out of my areas, but he's done quite well in that area. He was one of the people I definitely thought was going to hold. One of the independents I definitely thought was going to hold. So to see him on 10% is very, very interesting. He obviously left the Liberal Party after he got done for travel allowances, accommodation allowances scandals that the ICAC got him for. So he left the Liberal Party, became an independent. But he managed to run through until while that was happening, he managed to succeed in the 2022 election. So that didn't stop him there. And so I was suspecting it wouldn't stop him now, but interesting to see it possibly has.
Now, this is an example of a seat. I'm just recording it in my spreadsheet, Narunga, where it is going to be a Liberal versus One Nation contest. It seems pretty likely that'll be the case. Ellis, has had his vote completely collapse. One Nation did run there last time, but only had a small vote. Williams' estimate is predicting that One Nation would probably win, and I think that's likely on these numbers. They have a pretty big lead over the Liberal Party. Like the Liberals may do okay from Labor preferences or Ellis preferences. I don't think they're going to do that well. It's an interesting sign of like whether One Nation is just going to like run over the top of a bunch of these independents. But I'm putting that in my spreadsheet as One Nation leading.
Yeah,
So
definitely. I'll be interested to see how it goes further on in the night because, as it often happens with a lot of elections, these big gaps sometimes close out as we get more and more booths coming in and more votes coming in. So it might be interesting to see if that spread reduces, and that might give the Liberals the ability to win over One Nation.
Now I'm looking for some marginal seats that maybe have some interesting things to do. Again, one of the jobs we don't have anyone for, which is a job I help with the ABC for the federal election, which is other people to go looking for interesting seats to then suggest that we talk about. So thank you to the people in the comments who've been suggesting various places to go looking. Finnis, which is also very interesting. There's no data there. I'm interested in knowing about some of the super marginal Liberal seats: Murray Alta, Unley, Hyson. Nothing in any of those.
No.
And we've had a suggestion of Elizabeth. There's only one booth, and it's a small booth. But One Nation is leading Labor in Elizabeth.
Yes.
Now, this is outer northern suburbs of Adelaide. It is one of those traditional safe Labor seats. and One Nation has picked up a big chunk of the vote. The Greens vote is up slightly. The Labor vote has collapsed. So that, that is an example of a seat where One Nation, could be a threat. I believe this is a seat where the sitting Labor MP Lee Odenwalder has retired, and so there is a
Yeah.
new Labor candidate. So they have that problem as well.
Yeah, Lee was really well liked in the area. He was really, really well liked by the people of Elizabeth. Ella's come in. She's a lot younger. She comes from a bit of a different background. She's university student politics type background for Labor, so a bit of a different background than what Lee was or how Lee showcased himself. So there's that interesting thing there. I'll be interested to see if this continues because Hanton's campaign has been a bit rough. He recently got done for having his volunteers fill in how to vote cards after they had been registered with the ECSA. And that got him in a bit of trouble, bit of an breach of the Electoral Act there. So he's had a bit of rough roads there. So it'll be interesting to see if the rest of these boos come through and show him winning as well.
Now, I'm looking at Hartley here, so let's just pull Hartley up.
Yep.
Hartley was the seat, still is the seat, at least as far as we know, of Vincent Tarzia, who was the Liberal leader until the end of last year. Now, we've got two booths in Hartley, and one of them we have a two-candidate preferred count in where Labor is winning that two-candidate preferred count very comfortably. But if we look at the overall primary votes, we've got One Nation in fourth place. So they're not doing particularly well in Hartley. It's one of those kind of mid-suburban, kind of middle band of Adelaide seats. One Nation, the Greens are up slightly. The Liberal vote has halved, and the Labor vote is up slightly. So right now, this does look very much like a seat where Labor is leading, and it looks like a conventional Labor versus Liberal contest, but Labor is leading, and that would be one of those seats where we have this One Nation threat in the outer suburbs and the regions, but possibly alongside that, while Liberal and maybe Labor too are losing ground in those areas, in the inner city, there is a more conventional landslide victory to the left possibly happening. That would be consistent with this, that Liberals would lose that seat.
Yeah, definitely agree. Hartley, I've been saying is an interesting one because Tarzia is a fighter and a survivor. He as I think the ABC mentioned earlier, talking to Tom Tonis, he survived the Xenophon. So he's not. I wouldn't call him down and out until the numbers say he's down and out. But right now, it's not looking good for him.
Okay, now Carville. Now Josh Sunman, who's our next guest, is joining us in 13 minutes. This is his local area, and he picked the interesting one to watch. Right now, Labor is fourth on 21%. So it is practically a four-way tie. Matt Schultz, the independent, is on 24.1%. And, it is a sitting independent seat where Dan Cregan has retired. Dan Cregan actually... I was trying to work out which independent he was supporting. I mean, it does look like Schultz possibly has that benefit. But this is a seat.
Endorsing Schultz, yeah.
If it looks anything like this, they're projecting a 3CP that has the independent in front. The independent is leading. You would think that One Nation or Liberal, one of them will make the 3CP. Greens preferences maybe help Labor. Honestly, maybe things will change as we get more results, and this could just be one funny booth. This is one that's going to take a really long time to pick.
Oh, yeah, definitely agree. Schultz does have the benefit of both Cregan, but also the federal member, Rebecca Sharkey, has endorsed him as well. So that's why he's doing so well. He's had a lot of establishment support in this area gunning for him.
Now, let's just zoom out a little bit, look at the totals. Now, again, I'm not going through, no one does it on the night and picks seats one by one and calls them. Unless it's something like Peter Dutton in Dixon, usually most of the calls are made by the computer for individual seats. But right now, Williams' computer has Labor having won a single seat and ahead in 13 more. And then there's 5 Liberal, 3 One Nation, 1 Independent. So this does look like a Labor majority is likely right now. And it doesn't look like a total wipeout for the Liberal Party, but I think there's a lot of seats here where we're not going to have good preference data tonight.
I
And we're going
agree.
to have to keep track of that as the night goes on. I'm going to add a little thing to my spreadsheet going, do we have the correct pairing, so we can track as we go. Has the Exa picked the right pairing? Although again, I'm not blaming them for that. If we look at this statewide figure, One Nation is now leading the Liberal Party 24% to 23, with Labor on 33. Still a bit too early to try and make predictions about how the polls have gone, but One Nation is ahead of the Liberal Party and yet is winning fewer seats. That could also show us that part of the picture here is that a party that's further to the extreme, like One Nation, doesn't get as many preferences and effectively needs a higher vote to get an equivalent number of seats.
Yep. Yeah, definitely agree. It also probably shows that they're doing better in those rural and regional areas and worse in those urban. So we might be looking at like 10 to 15% in those urban and then 30% in those rural, and that's even balancing out in that total primary.
Now, another example of what could be some really crazy numbers. Again, the numbers here are very small. We're talking 2 booths out of 36. McKillop, which is in the southeast of South Australia, it kind of covers everything but Mount Gambier in that kind of southern tip of South Australia. One Nation right now is on 48%. So Nick McBride, who was the sitting independent MP for this seat, is miles behind. They have not included One Nation in the 2 candidate preferred count. If the numbers look anything like this, it won't matter. Like this seat would, if this was what the final figures look like, I would call it for One Nation. But as you can see, these numbers are pretty small. We've only got 162 votes. But thank you to the viewer who tipped McKillop.
This is a very interesting spread.
Looking through the comments for suggestions. Go ahead.
Just looking at how everything's going, I think definitely it's going to come down to how preferences actually flow and how many Liberal Labor preferences go to One Nation in the end. Because I think a lot of people who do put what Liberal or Labor first aren't necessarily thinking about those last preferences. And in a lot of times in Labor's case, they were giving how to vote cards out that were Labor and then in numerical order. So not everyone follows those how to vote cards. Obviously, with Labor, I think it's like 20 to 30%, but that could have a significant change in places where Labor isn't second. And that might give One Nation more votes. It might give Liberal more votes, depending on just how that plays out.
Okay, we are going to, we had a suggestion from Auckland FC 2024. It's a good suggestion to go look at the seat of Hammond, which is, one of those seats where it is looking very even. Just going to pull up my notes on the seat of Hammond, but it's one of those ones where independents have been threatening the Liberal Party for a while. Adrian Peterick holds it by 5.1% margin. Right now, he's in a very close 3-corner contest between One Nation, Liberal, Labor. On those numbers, I don't think Labor can win. Maybe. Again, this is where, I think probably this is one where William has worked out a 3CP that is not proving to be correct because Peterick. Peterick's the Liberal. I think there's an independent that was considered to be a bit of a threat, who is turning out not to be. Ellie Keane, that's right. So she's currently in 4th place on 13%. So I don't think she ends up in the 3CP. Her preference is maybe they help Labor a little bit, but I think this will probably end up being a One Nation versus Liberal contest. But it is complex pairing. We don't know who the 2CP will be. If this ends up anything like this at the end of the night, we are going to want to wait to find out who the top 2 are going to be. They're currently calling it as Liberal versus Labor. So by the end of the night, I think we'll know if it's close between Liberal versus Labor. But if One Nation was to get into that top 2, that would change things. And right now, you'd have to think there's a good chance of that.
Yeah, definitely.
Again, we're talking 2 booths here, but we're talking 1.2% of the vote. So most of these seats are pretty small. I'm looking for some seats. We might come back to Chafee in a minute. Hartley, we've already talked about Hartley and Lee. They're going up a bit.
Schubert has 4.7. Could be a good
Yeah,
one.
let's go to Schubert. That's Ashton Hearn's seat, who is the new leader of the Liberal Party. She's down 10%, 11% really. It's not clear if she's going to face off against a Labor candidate or a One Nation candidate. I think this
Yep.
is right. I think she will comfortably win if these numbers continue. But, that's an example where I think it does matter if you're someone who is credible, like has a bit more of a profile, has that personal vote, and is able to hold
Yep.
off a bit. Because the 11% swing is significant, but we're seeing some much more disastrous results for the Liberal Party.
And I definitely agree. And I think what this seat will come down to is if Labor and One Nation State is close, and it maybe even gets closer, as I think it might. It'll just look at how those green preferences flow, and you'd have to think those green preferences will majorly flow to Labor and probably let them go past One Nation into that two party preferred final round.
Now there was someone asking what app is this. So just to clarify, when we're doing screen sharing here, we are using Poll Bludger's results service. William Bowe, friend of the show, who is off doing other media commitments tonight, but has his own results service that is doing the kind of booth matching stuff you see from the ABC. But it's a little bit more focused on what analysts use. So feel free to go and check it out yourself at pollbludger.net/SA2026/results. Now. Let's just work out where we're going next here. We might just do this live and go back and look at the list. West Torrens has been called as a Labor gain. Labor retain. We already talked about that. 55% for Labor. That is very comfortable. That I'm going to have that as a win. And, we don't know who he's going to be against in the 2CP. It could be One Nation. It could be the Greens. The Liberal vote has
That's very
collapsed.
interesting, though. To see Liberal be fourth in that seat is very interesting to see.
And I think that's something, we might not get to it on the live blog tonight, but I think by tomorrow it'll be how much is it there's places where the Liberal Party is still winning, but other places where they have completely collapsed. Yeah, there's going to be a bunch of seats we're not going to know tonight. I think we'll probably come out tonight saying Labor's probably won a majority. We have a bit of a sense of what's going on, but there's going to be a lot of these really close contests to watch. Now, someone requested Chafee, and I was thinking of going back to Chafee. We've already looked at Chafee earlier. Again, it's looking really close between Liberal and One Nation, so it will come down to preferences, mainly from Labor, but there's also at least 15. Shouldn't do maths on the run, but I guess that's what you do on a night like this. At least 15% with other candidates. Yeah.
It'd be very interesting to see how some of those preferences flow, because they may become quite relevant depending on how close this seat ends up being. You'd imagine the Nationals would be going for preferencing towards the Liberals, but the Nationals in SA are a bit of a weird party altogether. One of their policies is to ban pokies. So, they're a bit of a weird party. So knowing who's voting for them and who's actually how they're preferencing is would be an interesting one. Same with the independents in this seat. Same with legalized cannabis. They've always got really weird preference flows. So if any of those end up mattering, if we get to a close enough there, you're going to have to wait probably quite a while to really know.
Yeah. I'm just cleaning up the comments a little bit. But we got a request for Wright. There's no results data for Wright. There is still a bunch of seats. If I pull up the list of seats here, there's still a bunch of seats that have no result data at all. And the swings, if we look through here, there's a bunch of seats where we don't have conventional. There's going to be not that many seats end up as conventional Labor versus Liberal contests, but where we do have swings on the two-party preferred vote, Labor's vote is mostly up. They're down quite a bit in Mawson, and that is one where I believe the sitting Labor MP, who was the Speaker, whose name eludes me right now, has retired. That's one of those kind of semi-rural seats down there covering Mayor Leon Bignell. And
Yeah.
so, it's one of those places where Labor MPs are retiring, and One Nation is competitive. Labor's One Nation's on 25% there, and Labor's down on 23. Again, that's just only two booths. Would want to see a bit more there, but Mawson is looking interesting.
Yep. Giles has a 2.9% counted. That could be an interesting. It even says 3.5% on
Giles.
Poll Lodger. Yeah, could be a very
Yeah,
interesting one.
yeah. I've got 3% there. Again, One Nation's on 37%, Labor's on 35. So that's turning into a Labor versus One Nation contest with the Liberals way down in third place.
Yep.
That is one where you'd have to think One Nation has a good chance of winning, and that is a 17% Labor seat. But again, this is a rare example of a regional Labor seat. There aren't a lot of Labor seats outside of Adelaide. And so, this doesn't necessarily tell you much about what's going on elsewhere, but this is one where it's very clear that it's Labor versus One Nation. The two candidate preferred count is correct in that seat. But right now it is Labor versus One Nation, and we will find out as the night goes on. We have one booth in, and it's showing One Nation well ahead. They are gaining a lot more preferences than Labor. But we'll see how that goes there. Giles, definitely one where One Nation could be competitive.
Yeah.
Chafee continues to bring in more votes, 6.6%. I think that'll become clearer as the night goes on. So let's zoom out a little bit. It's 8 o'clock, and we'll have Josh joining soon, I'm sure. I'll just check my email to make sure there's no urgent crisis happening here, and there is not. But the general picture right now is, I think the polls are mostly playing out as predicted. We are seeing a very high One Nation vote. They are competitive in lots of places. The places where they're not completely wiping out the Liberal Party. Liberal Party is still winning a handful of seats. Who comes second is still unclear, either on primary votes. At the moment, we've got 1.1% of the vote counted statewide. So it's pretty early, and there's definitely a rural bias. But One Nation is now on 24 and Liberals are on 22. Labor's vote right now is a bit lower than what it was in the polls, but that probably is explainable by there being this rural bias. I expect Labor's vote will go up as the night goes on. So far, they're ahead in more than half the seats where there's an estimate. We've also seen some examples of independents, getting steamrolled by One Nation. So, I think right now we wouldn't rule out the possibility that One Nation might end up as the second biggest party in the parliament, or the second biggest party in the vote.
Yeah, I definitely. I think it'll be interesting to see how it goes. I think as we get more and more urban seats, I think we will see maybe that One Nation vote decrease a bit and that Liberal vote increase. Same with that Labor one. It'll be interesting to see how that actually ends up. I saw somebody ask about Legislative Council, and that's going to be just a completely different monster, I think. Most people are predicting 5 Labor, 2 Liberal, 2 One Nation, and then 1 Green, and the final seat being, I've seen predictions all the way from Labor, Liberal, etc., all the way down to legalized cannabis, Animal Justice Party, SA Best, etc. So that's going to be a really interesting one in the Legco. But yeah, I think we're seeing really interesting results so far. I'm going to be interested to keep following them and see how they go once we get to that 10% counted, 20% counted, where we can start having some very firm knowledge of, especially those swings where we might see One Nation in the 2 candidate preferred and maybe even first in primary.
And Josh Sunman, welcome to the election night. Thanks for joining us.
Hi Ben, great to be with you.
Yeah, what are your first thoughts?
My first kind of thoughts is I've been watching seat results as they've come in, and I've been listening to the coverage, obviously. Some of the seats we've been having a look at where One Nation are kind of in play, like Hammond, etc. Hammond will be kind of won or lost on the Big Murray Bridge and Strathalbyn booths, which are a lot more urban than I think the Wellington and Harrogate booths, which are what are in. Likewise with Carville, we have one of the small Adelaide Hills towns in Charleston which is kind of leafy, kind of wealthy area. That seat will be won and lost on the big Mount Barker booths, which will come in, I suspect, quite late in the night, particularly the big pre-poll centre in Mount Barker as well. What I'm seeing across the metropolitan area is pretty devastating for the Liberal Party. Like, yes, the results are small, but it's one-way traffic. The Liberal Party has collapsed across the metropolitan area. Labor's primary is largely holding in the inner metro, up slightly perhaps in a place like Hartley. It's looking pretty clear, I think, at this point that Vincent Tarzia is going down. Which is quite a shock to people who are saying, you know, he is a fighter, etc. He fought off Nick Xenophon, but he can't fight off a 28% swing in his primary vote. Likewise, in the outer metro, we are seeing a lot of One Nation strength, and we're seeing, you know, outlets like the ABC Computer are kind of struggling to put that into two candidate preferred terms. But we are seeing a kind of a One Nation primary in some of those outer suburban seats approaching about 30%. And if Labor can be held kind of under 45, they're in that danger zone.
Yeah, it is quite remarkable. I am fascinated by the idea here that we are seeing kind of two different stories. That in the inner city, in that kind of mid-suburban middle band, which is the only Liberal seats in Adelaide, you know, One Nation's, they're doing okay, but it is actually quite a strong swing from Liberal to Labor. The story that we were expecting last year is happening there, and that seems to be, you know, for example, what's brought Vincent Tarzia undone. But then there's a whole other thing, including Labor getting hit in, you know, places like Elizabeth, Mawson, Giles, which are, you know, Elizabeth's the outer north, Mawson is the outer south, arguably regional, but on the southern edge of Adelaide.
Yeah, what we have in from Mawson so far is Kangaroo Island booths mostly, and Leon Bignell, after a bushfire crisis, managed to really build up his kind of local credentials there. So I think we're not going to be able to make much of a call on the trajectory of Mawson until we see kind of the big old Dinga booths, which is where most of the population is, and some of the more inner regional booths like McLaren Vale and stuff, which have very different kind of outlines compared to Kangaroo Island. Kangaroo Island's a bit of a weird place. You have to get on a ferry to get there. There's no bridge or anything like that. So I don't know if I'd take that and extrapolate it to the whole electorate.
Speaking of taking things and extrapolating them to whole electorates, I just want to mention Hyson, where this is probably the biggest hope for the Greens. And again, it's just one booth, but the Greens are in fourth place. So I wouldn't rule them out on this, but it's not a good early sign for them there. But again, you know, we'd want some more. And I mean, again, we keep emphasizing this. We're using the results we have. Generally, swings and projections are based on comparing like with like, but pretty much everywhere, rural comes in first, urban comes in later. So on a statewide basis, that's true, but it's also true within electorates, right? That the big towns in rural seats will come in later than the small, like outlying areas. So kind of at every level, we would expect to see that kind of rural bias. But, you know, Hyson, Greens not doing very well in their first booth.
Yeah, we do have a bit of an update on Giles as well, that One Nation Labor contest. Some Port Augusta figures have come in and have One Nation running about 50.2 to 48.8 versus Labor. I suspect once the Whyalla booths come in, One Nation might need to be doing a little bit better than that to be able to knock them off.
Yeah, definitely.
That would be my expectation.
Agree.
That's Eddie Hughes' hometown, etc.
Yeah, so Giles, for people who aren't familiar with the electorate, covers a large area in kind of Western South Australia and covers mostly two towns, right? Whyalla and Port Augusta. And it kind of covers half of Port Augusta. Correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but it covers kind of part of Port Augusta and then Whyalla.
It's most of Port Augusta these days, actually, in the last redistribution. Yeah.
But, you know, it's one of these seats where Labor it's kind of one of the last of these Labor regional electorates. But frankly, if Labor was going to lose a seat to One Nation, that would be the interesting place to watch. But we don't have anything from Whyalla yet, even on primary votes.
If Hughes is managing to kind of hold them to 50-50 in Port Augusta, you would assume he'll be able to do a bit better in Whyalla.
I mean, something else we don't really know much about is generally minor parties, independents don't do as well on pre-poll.
Correct.
And we won't get pre-poll till much later. The pre-poll is going to be big, as we talked about earlier. 35% of the vote was cast early, and we don't really know probably One Nation won't do quite as well on those votes.
I just want to draw our attention to Waite, which is for a long time was a really traditional Liberal seat, the home of the Liberal movement, the home of the Australian Democrats. Labor are scoring something in the region of an 18% swing, 27 on primary, and look like they might run away with that. That's remarkable as kind of someone who lives in Adelaide. That is Liberal heartland territory up until the last election that is now with a Labor margin looking about 20%. That's
again,
incredible.
that looks pretty similar to West Torrens, to even to Hartley, where, you know, Labor is what, I mean, Tarsi's seat is not quite as strong a case, but definitely West Torrens, where we don't know who the top two are here, and we probably won't know for a while, but it doesn't matter because Labor's so far in advance. Again,
speaking of
booths, but
former Liberal leaders, at the moment, it appears that David Spears is on 4th place in black, and Labor are looking to do about the same numbers as in the by-election, but probably this time perhaps versus a One Nation candidate.
Again, I'm not finding many seats where it's clear who the 2CP is supposed to be.
No,
who the
like
top two are.
You can go through about 40 of the 47 seats and go, Labor are in the top 2, but you can't work out who else is there.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, I probably should sum everything up for a minute, Josh, just for people who might not have been watching. It's now 7:40 in South Australia. We have 2.1% of the vote counted, so it's still pretty early on. We're expecting about a third of the vote to be pre-poll votes that will come in quite late in the night, but we're starting to get a bit of a flavour of what's going on. And what is going on is that One Nation is taking a large share of the vote. They've got 23.5% of the vote so far. They are well ahead of the Liberal Party. Labor's primary is increasing as we're seeing more urban votes come in. They are in a clear first place, and they are ahead in a lot of seats. You know, the election results computers are doing their best to try and estimate where preferences are going to flow, but there's a lot we don't know. Right now, Liberal and One Nation are kind of neck and neck in terms of seats they're going to win, but there's a lot of seats we don't know. So right now, it does look likely that we're going to see a Labor government, but One Nation's vote is holding up very well. Right now, I would say the polls do seem reasonably accurate. In terms of the regions, we are seeing One Nation possibly taking Labor seats on the outer edges of Adelaide and in regional areas, as well as Liberal seats in the regions. But in the Liberal seats in the middle third of Adelaide, Labor is doing very well there, and it looks like they've probably defeated Vincent Tarzia in his seat, who was the Liberal leader until the end of last year. So that's the state of things at this point. If you're finding this useful, I would love it if you would consider signing up as a donor on Patreon for the Tally Room, and that's what allows things like this to happen. But thanks for joining us. Josh, did you want to jump in on any other seats?
I'm just having a look. Things like Elizabeth now are starting to firm up a bit more for the Labor Party in these kind of outer suburban seats. What I'm looking for is if Labor and Green hits about 50, One Nation probably can't run them down. And that's what's happening in Elizabeth at the moment. So the Labor vote's 37, the Greens are on about 13. There are some various other kind of minor parties in there. You would suspect then on those kind of numbers were they to hold up, Labor probably holds up in a seat like that. That's where they've come under the most threats so far. But it's interesting, like a seat like Davenport, which is a traditional marginal, Labor are winning on primary, and yet it looks like One Nation will be second. That's very much not an outer metropolitan seat, actually. Being a Flinders academic, Davenport actually, I believe, sometimes is the seat Flinders main campus is in. So that's remarkable to see One Nation coming second there.
Anthony, do you have any seats you want to talk about?
I'm about to head off, but I think a seat we should look at is Mount Gambier. That results are coming in there, and that's a very interesting to see. The Poll Bludger site and the ABC site have different ideas of the 2CP. Travis Fatchin being in there, One Nation being in there is kind of breaking both those counts because they're not entirely certain who's going to do the best. Labor's currently in the 2CP for both of them, but is only polling at a 15%. So this might actually be an independent versus One Nation seat.
Okay, so in the Discord, there has been a little bit of conversation about whether this kind of thing would happen because we've had a lot of seats that have not been Labor versus Coalition at recent elections. I have never seen a seat that has been two candidates, neither of them in a major party, competing against each other for a seat. If you want to find real examples of it, you've got to go back to the Lang Labor Party in the 40s. Like you go back a very long time, and things might change. We've got, 4 booths out of 15 is not bad. Almost 10% of the vote counted, but it does look like independent versus One Nation. The preference count is between independent and Liberal, so it is wrong, but it does give us a bit of a sense that the independent is doing a lot better than the Liberal. But One Nation has a much higher primary vote than the independent. I would think probably the independent would be the favourite here. I would have to think they would do relatively better from both Liberal, Labor, Greens. I mean, there is a former One Nation independent, Cody Scholes, on 5.5% as well. But this is one where it's going to be. We're going to need a preference count in the next couple of days, but it's going to be independent versus One Nation.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with the sentiments that we would favour the independent there just because of the wad of Labor preferences. But yeah, it will be a long count there, I suspect.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, because that was a big one I've been saying was going to be probably the hardest to predict. I don't think I've seen anyone predict it would be independent versus One Nation. This is my game, but with its member being complete. I'm off, but yeah, I'm technically at a joint 30th party.
Well, thanks for joining us, Anthony.
I'll head off,
but go ahead.
Just to say, this has been great. This has been a great live stream. I think this will be very interesting. I think we'll see some stuff firm up as more and more votes come out. I think for now, it'll be interesting to see whether or not any of these leads for One Nation actually do translate into seats. Because currently, nobody's called a seat for them. They're ahead in some places. It's going to come down to actually redoing how the preferences are counted and counting those preferences as well. So that'll be interesting to see tonight and probably over the next couple of days.
Thanks for joining us, Anthony.
So thank you.
Thanks. So to give us the amount of votes we're getting is still relatively low. It's 7:45 in South Australia now. We've got about a 2.6% of the vote counted. One Nation very clearly ahead of the Liberal Party in second place, which is again something that I don't think has ever happened. They're actually polling a little bit higher than they were at the 1998 Queensland election, which was their previous best result. Right now, it is looking like the polls, right? It is looking like a result where a Labor Party that frankly is not polling very well, I think their vote will go up, but I don't think it'll get to 40%, are going to win probably a large number of seats, but it's going to take a long time to actually know that for sure.
Yeah, I'm having a look at some of the numbers, like say in a safe seat like Florida, they're coming in. Labor are getting very lucky with their vote distribution versus One Nation. Like we're at just that little bit lower in a lot of these seats, particularly Elizabeth. They might very well be finding themselves going down to some One Nation candidates, but because their votes are just high enough, they're just managing to get over the line. And if we kind of come back to Mawson as well, which is one where we see Labor ahead on 35, and we have the Liberals and One Nation fighting for second place on 24 and 23. So that one's going to take a while, I think, to work out. Based upon the other people who are in the count, you might favour the Liberals coming second, but obviously a lot more counting to come here. That one's going to go down to the wire.
So again, to clarify how this works, they do a primary vote count, first preferences for everyone, and then they have picked in advance who the top two are most likely to be, and they are getting it wrong a lot. But I don't blame the Electoral Commission for that. Anyone will get it wrong a lot. It's very hard to tell. And in even more cases, we don't know if they've got it right or got it wrong because we won't know that for some time. So in this case, they are doing a Labor versus Liberal preference count. And actually, Liberals are winning that preference count right now. It's only 2 booths in so far. But it's one of those ones where at the end of the night, we might say if the Liberals make the final count, they win. But we don't know if they're going to beat One Nation because right now they're just ahead of One Nation. So we're going to see a lot of this kind of stuff where, we have a rough sense of what's happening here, but there's going to be a long list of seats needing to be decided after tonight.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite remarkable. We've not, I don't think, had a single seat hit 10% yet. Mount Gambier is the closest on 9.7. I mean, this is quite a slow count. There's still, fortunately, a lot to talk about, but a very slow count so far.
Okay, here's a question for you, Josh. Would you call this for Labor as a Labor
absolutely.
win?
Yeah. There's just no possibility. This is a Labor win with an increased majority.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to call that now as well. I believe others have also called it, but I'm just going to update the text here. Labor retains government with increased majority. But, frankly, that's not really the most interesting bit of the story tonight. It's not really about who forms government. Everyone kind of expected Peter Malinauskas to form government, and he will, almost certainly with quite a substantial majority. But really, the focus here is very much on what's been going on the right.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the right, it's a pretty poor story for the Liberal Party. At the moment, I can find them clearly ahead in, that's changed since I last looked at it. But, they're a shot in Flinders. And I would say they're kind of clearly ahead in Schubert. Aside from that, I can't find much for the Liberal Party.
Yeah. It's not great. I mean, I'm looking at Bragg here. They're on 41% in Bragg. Off one booth. They, One Nation's only on 10, but again, that's just one booth.
There's one booth, but if you add Labor and Green, they're on 47. That's tough.
Yeah.
That's tough.
I mean, presumably they would get One Nation preferences there, but again, Schubert, she's got a pretty decent lead here. I mean, one of the big question marks for me is I am pretty confident that Liberal preferences would favour One Nation over Labor. If it is a Labor versus One Nation contest, we've got political blocks that have developed in this country where, Greens voters have become closer to Labor, One Nation voters have become closer to Liberal, and vice versa. Some of it is people changing their minds, some of it is people switching between groups. But the real question I don't think we understand here is Labor. If Labor comes third, Labor How to Votes have been putting the Liberal Party ahead of One Nation. Do their voters follow it? Because in a place like Schubert, which I realise I have up on my second screen, in a place like Schubert, if Labor preferences favour Ashton Hearn, she's probably fine, and I think she probably is fine. But we don't really know how those.
And we still have that question of whether Green Labor flows would be enough to actually revert it to a standard 2 candidate preferred count.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We still actually don't know our finishing order there until I would expect Labor actually would make the 2 candidate preferred there on the current numbers.
Interestingly, they seem to be doing a Liberal versus One Nation count there. So we should get a clearer sense of that. But if there's Greens preferences, animal justice favour Labor, they could end up ahead of One Nation.
I mean, that's what it looks like. But again, it depends on what happens with the bigger Barossa towns, right? One seat at the moment where we can say One Nation have a clear lead is Narungga. We have One Nation on about 36, 37. The Liberals on 25. The incumbent independent trailing really poorly on 16. And then some Labor votes at about 15. I mean, Labor have preferenced the Liberals, but you would still, I think, favour One Nation if the numbers look anything like this at the end of the night.
Yeah, we're not going to get the right preference count there.
No.
So it's going to be very messy.
Very messy count. Let me just have a quick look at the other kind of messy counts.
So we're at this stage now where we have a pretty good sense of what's going on, but we don't have anywhere near enough of the vote counted to call most of these. But frankly, we're not going to get that vote tonight. We're going to have a long list of seats where we go, these ones, we need a different 2CP. These ones, we need a 3CP to know what the 2CP should be. These ones, that's not even going to work. You know, the kind of Colwell cases where there's four. I mean, was it Carville that we looked at a while ago where it was that kind of really close? Nothing has changed in Carville.
On 22%. No.
There's only been one booth reported. There's absolutely nothing new has happened in Carville.
We know nothing until Mount Barker basically dumps its votes in about an hour's time, I would expect. So
yeah.
So yeah, we are really kind of in this holding pattern. I think what we will know by the end of tonight is the metropolitan marginals will be decided, and pretty decisively in Labor's favour. And it's really interesting to see, I know they're not contested tonight, but seats like Lee, the one that's being vacated by the former Treasurer Stephen Mulligan, like 2 elections ago, this was the contest for government. Like Lee was where Labor and the Liberal Party were fighting it out. And we currently have the Liberal Party on 11%. Like this was the contest for government was happening in seats like Lee. And we now have One Nation, a clear second, and the Liberals in 4th behind the Greens. I think that's just extraordinary in seats that really, if the Liberal Party ever wanted to have a long-term government in South Australia, they would need to at least be competitive in.
Yeah, and again, not the right 2CP.
Yeah, exactly. I
wouldn't be surprised if we end up
prioritizing that, but you know, like it's just like we can tell based on the primary that Labor can't be run down from there. But yeah, there's going to be a lot of these seats that get corrected over the next 2 weeks, I expect.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be something we talk about a bit later, but I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with like 10 or 20 seats where we get that data. Like it's not going to be that many.
No, we have the correct huge one.
So for what it's worth, Williams' computer, which is again a little bot that's off running with estimates that have been put in, currently has Labor leading in 38 seats and 18 and is ahead in 30. And has Liberals winning or ahead in 5 and One Nation leading or ahead in 4. So it is one of these ones where I suspect the 2PP will be very high for Labor when if to the extent that can be calculated. And we're about to have Kevin Bonham join us because it is approaching 8 p.m. in Adelaide. You're welcome to stick around a bit longer, Josh. But we are getting a bit more of a sense of where things are going. And I'll invite Kevin in, and while Kevin's getting set up, I'll just give a general update on what the picture is right now. Good evening, Kevin. I am just going to run through where we're up to. Right now, we've got almost 5% of the vote counted. The Labor primary, as expected, is increasing, and the Liberal and One Nation primaries are both going down. Frankly, right now, the polls are looking pretty good. We've got Labor in the high 30s, One Nation in the low 20s, Liberals in the high teens. In terms of what is happening in the seats, there is a lot of seats where we only have a rough sense of what is happening. One Nation is doing very well in a lot of places, and frankly, there's a lot we're not going to know tonight. Kevin, what are your thoughts? Welcome to the live stream. What are your thoughts on what's going on?
Oh, that's a dream number for the polls. The way that it looks at the moment. If they could, they would, as a consensus across the average of them, maybe not all the individual ones, but as an average, they would take what we've got on the screen now and bottle it. But we have to wait and see what happens when pre-polls hit the mix.
And that is a big thing we don't know is pre-polls. So in terms of the stages of knowledge we're going to get, we're getting the primary votes now. And in a few places, we're getting useful 2-candidate preferred counts starting to trickle in. But in most places, frankly, they're not that useful. The second stage will be later tonight. We will know the pre-polls. The third stage will be in the next few days, the places where the Electoral Commission is able to re-throw its 2-candidate preferred. And then there's going to be a bunch of seats where, you know, maybe they do some 3-candidate preferreds, maybe they wait till the final distribution, but there's going to be seats where we're going to have to wait, you know, probably a couple of weeks to know who's won.
Yeah, one booth in, but we now have an absurd count in Port Adelaide as well.
By absurd, you mean very good for Labor?
It's good for Labor, but they'll probably win it. But we have the 2CP being kind of done on a basis of Labor and Independent. The Independents in 4th probably ends up being a Labor One Nation contest. But
For anyone who's watching this broadcast and wondering what's going on, Japan is currently leading 1-0 in the Asian Cup final, which is going on now. So if you wanted to know how that was going, but still a lot of time to go. They're about 28 minutes into that. So yeah, we're at this point where information's trickling in, but again, like looking at Port Adelaide there, One Nation. Yeah, surely Labor wins that, but again, if stuff doesn't change, but there's a long way to go.
Yeah, there's just so many seats at the moment. I mean, and every metropolitan primary has almost every metropolitan marginal has almost a double-digit swing to the ALP, and most of that is just based off preferences. Like in terms of the Liberal primary has collapsed. In some places, the Labor primary is slightly up, but in other places, it's steady. It's just a massive collapse on the right side of politics for the Liberals. I mean, we have some numbers in from Newland now, where the ALP are on 46%. This was a seat they won to form government last time. The Liberals are on 8%. Yes, it's one booth, but holy.
Yeah. So this is one where it will definitely be Labor versus One Nation.
Yeah.
Labor should retain it. Again, it's one small booth, but if those numbers continue, this would be an example of a seat where we just have the wrong. We know that it's Labor versus One Nation. It probably doesn't really matter because Labor probably is going to win against all comers, but maybe things will get a bit closer as the night goes on. I doubt it, but we will probably find out Monday, Tuesday. We'll get a proper preference count there.
Yeah. At the moment, you would say the Liberals are a good chance in the seat of Bragg and the seat of Bragg only in Adelaide.
Yeah.
And even then, it's a chance.
So we are seeing an increasing number of seats where, the computer is calling it for Labor. I mean, there's seats like Gibson, which we haven't even looked at tonight, where Labor's in the high 40s. Again, we don't really know who's second. It's Liberal or One Nation. Green's not far behind, but Labor's probably winning that seat. Labor has won that seat.
Yeah.
Then you've got we talked about Giles. Interestingly, let's go to Giles. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this one, Kevin, because this was one earlier was looking very good for One Nation. We are starting to get preference flows here that have One Nation in front, but Josh, your point was that we don't have any preferences yet from Whyalla, which is probably Labor's better part of the seat, and One Nation isn't winning by that much in the remainder of the seat.
No, I think that's going to be the real decider here is how do those kind of Whyalla booths break down. I'm just having a look through the exercise as we speak to see if there's anything coming in. I mean, Labor are polling in the first Whyalla booth we've had in a small one, Whyalla Central East, 63% primary. So, Labor's vote in Whyalla is holding quite strong. Even if it's a bit weaker in that in some of the bigger Norrie and Stewart booths, you would still expect them to kind of run down One Nation from there quite easily.
Kevin, what are you watching?
Sorry, I briefly disappeared because one of my computers malfunctioned and let's grab another one. So I'm watching.
Good.
So we've got a number of seats where there's a number of these independent seats that I've watched that have very messy primary vote counts that we'll be waiting for a while to see what the exclusion order is in them, like Mount Gambier and Cavell. Cavell's currently got nobody above 24%, but that will probably change when we get more representative booths in. So the exclusion order in those will probably become clearer later on in the night. The overall picture, of course, that Labor is doing extremely strongly in Adelaide City, and we're left with these sort of scraps of a few seats for the One Nation and the Liberals are fighting over is much what the polls look like. There's not a lot of there's not that many. I think the Liberals are probably doing better at the moment than in seat terms than perhaps was thought, but there's not that much life there.
Chat just pointed out as well that the Greens have kind of slipped into second in Hyson. They have, but it's by about 5 votes over the ALP. So I think we're maybe getting set up for a very long 3CP there to determine who probably, with the Liberals on a 29% primary, defeats Josh Teague at this stage.
I mean, this is how the Greens win seats nowadays, is that they push Labor into third, right? And that would be one where the 3CP is the one that matters, not really the 2CP particularly. I mean, it matters a little bit. One nation preferences will help the Liberal Party there, but right now we have a preference. We have a tiny preference count that has Liberal in front of Labor, but not by very much. So that is going to be one to watch for a long time.
So there's a funny thing that's happened it'll be interesting to see if it still happens. There was a funny thing that happened in some of the Queensland seats that the Greens won in the 2022 federal election, where when One Nation preferences are splitting between the Greens, the Labor and the Liberals, the Greens actually get more than the Labor do. I'm not sure if that would still be the case, but it would be an interesting thing to see if those votes stayed where they are but it's a very long time to go in terms of seeing where the Green vote ends up and whether they're still competitive later on.
For people who, just to give you a bit of a sense of what we're following here, we are using William Bowe's Poll Bludger result service, which does booth matching and is very helpful. It is still making assumptions about various things based on preferences that we don't have a lot of data about, so that's worth noting. But thank you to William for use of this website. There was also mention earlier of the Discord, and someone was asking what Discord. That's actually a Discord for people who donate to the Tally Room. So if that is something you are interested in, Tally Room membership is $8 plus GST per month, and there's a bit of a chat happening there, and that's also a place to talk about elections the rest of the time. So thank you to everyone who supports the Tally Room there, and I know Kevin, your website, you also take donations as well. But yeah, this has a long time to go. I mean, I was talking about finishing the live stream at 10 o'clock. I'm not sure if we'll feel like we're done at that point, but we may well have a bit of a quiet period where not much comes in for a little while, and then we have a kind of late night surge. So we might just see how we go there.
We've just had results in from another of the Adelaide marginals, a Liberal held seat being held by Matt Cowdery, who was Shadow Treasurer. I mean, ABC are showing a 17% two-party swing there in Colton.
Colton, yeah.
Huge. 29%, 30% even drop in the Liberal primary, which is incredible to see. So
it has Labor Area Bolkus, daughter of Nick, the former Labor senator, on 44% primary vote. It's 3 booths in. We will get. It looks like it will end up being a classic contest. So we will actually get proper preference data from that seat tonight. But William's computer has already called it for Labor as a gain.
Yeah. This is looking to be every bit as bad as it was predicted to be for the Liberal Party. I think if we had to call it right now, they probably still end up ahead of seats in One Nation. I can only find one reasonably firm One Nation in Warunga. McKillop is looking like an independent One Nation contest that we won't know for a while. That being said, and then Mount Gambier, of course, we have a mess of preferences as well, where an independent probably comes out on top. So we've got really a few seats we can find for the Liberals, one for One Nation, but One Nation certainly in kind of vote terms have been doing dramatically close to what the polling was suggesting.
Yeah. I mean, we're getting numbers in slowly. Maybe we just pick a few other seats we go through. The picture is reasonably similar. Maybe we go to Mount Gambier. We haven't been to Mount Gambier in a while. Independent versus One Nation. The Independent versus Liberal 2CP is very strong. And so William's computer is calling that for the independent. I would say independent likely there. Like that looks like probably an independent seat. And that's somewhere where we can get a correct preference count reasonably clearly. But Mount Gambier is looking good for the independent. Right now, that's the only seat that the independents have clearly won. Carville, they're competitive. I want to look at some, unless either of you have any seats you really want to jump into, maybe we look at Hammond, which is currently listed as One Nation ahead with a 98.6% probability of victory, which is probably stretching things a little bit because
I think that's
slightly
bullish.
It's if they end up with the Liberals in third, I think that's true, but I think Liberals getting ahead of Labor to then turn it into a Liberal versus One Nation contest could make it a bit more interesting. But I mean that is looking pretty good for One Nation. Kevin?
Yeah, that is one where it's very sensitive to the exclusion order if the Liberals can come up a bit and knock out Labor, but there is that 4.5% Greens vote, so the Greens preferences pushing Labor up higher in the 3CP, meaning that the Liberals are considerably further behind than they look on the 3% the 3% primary gap. In fact, they might even have. I don't know if they can catch One Nation instead. That might be more of a prospect. We've also got preferences coming through from Ely Keane, whatever those will do.
She has issued an open ticket, so we have no idea.
Yeah, I suspect that Labor do not too badly off those as well. I've kicked Mount Gambier out of the messy seats list on my website. If the way that's going, Fatchin is fine there at the moment.
What other seats are on that list, Kevin? Let's go through some of them.
They're sort of going in rapidly as I see more of them. But so at the moment, Hammond, Cavell. Finnis, I just had a look at that. That looked pretty messy, but I'll have to have a closer look at that to see where they're
Finnis. Let's
tracking.
do it live.
So,
let's have a look at Finnis. I'll pull it up on the screen. It's pretty clearly. It looks pretty like that you've got Liberal versus One Nation, but then you have this big independent vote, big Labor vote. Maybe Labor pushes the independent into the top two, which is actually what William's computer is saying. What do you think?
Labor have been accused of basically running dead in favour of Lou Nicholson. Peter Malinauskas actually went down and held meetings with her during the campaign. So I'd expect quite a strong flow from Labor and the Green candidate, towards Lou Nicholson. So I think she'd have a reasonable shot of making the two candidate preferred. But the question is it Liberals or One Nation who that's against?
Yeah, that one. I mean,
doozy.
Who knows? Probably One Nation doesn't win there. I mean, I think One Nation probably doesn't win, but it's very hard to say. We will get a Liberal versus Independent count later tonight, so that will be useful for the scenario where the Independent gets ahead of One Nation.
Finnis,
but we won't know that
also
for sure.
have to say, has an absolutely huge pre-poll and postal vote. I think it's the oldest electorate in South Australia, so I think there'll be. And I remember last election, Lou Nicholson had a 54.7% two-candidate preferred versus the Liberal on the night, and then the pre-polls come along and just demolished that. So I think this is one that we're absolutely waiting for that big bucket of votes at the end of the night to have any real idea what's going to happen.
Okay, so we got an interesting question here. I'll put it up on the screen. Can the panel please explain how One Nation can get second most votes but no seats? Will One Nation still be able to have influence in the state? Now, I wouldn't say right now that they're not going to get any seats. I think they are probably going to win some. They are competitive in a lot of places. But what is going on here is that every seat is its own contest, right? And so we don't have proportional representation in Australia. And I think really everyone except Labor is hurting from that right now, is that you have a bunch of individual contests. And so in some places, you've got Labor preferences helping the Liberal Party beat One Nation when One Nation does very well. Then you've got Labor versus One Nation, but then there's independent and there's Green preferences. So I think One Nation are actually competitive in quite a few seats. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that they come second. But, you know, they're getting over 20% of the vote. You know, if that was, you know, we're talking like they'd get 10 seats, that would be their proportional share. And I don't think Liberal or One Nation are going to come anywhere near what would be their proportional share, let alone the Greens or anyone like that. And it just shows that in a scattered field, often the party that's in first place, particularly if they can do okay out of preferences, can win in a lot of places because each seat is decided on its own merits. And they get the same kind of small wins in a lot of places. Plus, I mean, Labor in South Australia has a very efficient vote. I don't know if Kevin or Josh, you want to go into like what that dynamic we've seen in the past where they've tried so hard to draw boundaries that don't give Labor an advantage in the two-party race without really any success.
We've had a long, fraught history in South Australia of trying to introduce this thing called a fairness clause, where we've tried to balance what party wins the right amount of seats in a kind of, a majoritarian system where we allocate preferential votes. That's almost impossible to do. Labor has a really efficient vote in Adelaide City, and that's really coming out to work for them tonight as One Nation start to pressure them on the fringes of it. In terms of the other side of that question, which is influence, One Nation are going to be in this parliament. They're going to win, if these numbers are replicated in the upper house, at least 2, with a shot of a third seat. Cory Bernardi and Carlos Caremba will both be elected to the upper house. They will be a presence in South Australian politics for the next 8 years. So they will get influence in that upper house, which rewards kind of proportional vote shares. In the lower house, I suspect, as kind of Ben says, there's at least one I can really see them in, and there's a range of others where they are competitive.
Yeah, I'm gonna answer one question, then I might take a break for a minute, and you two can talk while I just run out of the room for a sec. Sorry, that is the wrong one. That is someone responding to a different question. Sorry about that. Here is it here. A lot of comments coming through. How many seats are there historically when neither major party made the 2CP count? Now, earlier I said there hasn't been a single one. Nicklin, you are right. In the 2001 Queensland election was an independent versus One Nation contest. And that is the same kind of example we're talking about happening here tonight. That you have kind of an independent as the progressive option and a One Nation candidate as the conservative option. Very rare. Beyond that, you've got to go back to the 1940s to like Lang Labor, places like people like that. If either of you want to jump in on that or just talk generally about the state, I'm going to I'll be off for 5 minutes and then I'll be back shortly.
Yeah,
Sure.
There are a few other weird cases like that. There's one in Western Australia that finished independent Labor versus independent. Not sure quite how long ago it was, at least some number of decades, but it's rare, and we might see cases of it tonight.
Yeah, it's quite rare, and we're going to see a bit of a concentration of it tonight. There was a question in chat that I thought Senate terms were 6 years, not 8. In South Australia, and I believe in New South Wales as well, the term for the upper house is 8 years because we have fixed 4-yearly elections. So every March in every 4 years, South Australia will have an election on a fixed date. Tasmania nominally has that as well, of course, but as Kevin would be able to tell you, that doesn't necessarily happen anymore. So is there any questions in the chat that you would like to ask or any seats you want us to have a quick look at?
I should say for Tasmania, our upper house terms are 6 years. When the lower house collapses and goes to an early election, as it seems to do every 5 minutes, the upper house members aren't affected by that. They keep going on their rolling schedule, with a few of them coming up for election every year, and they can't be the upper house can't be dissolved unless it votes to dissolve itself. So so they do get 6-year terms, but yeah, 8 years. It's a long time.
No, and just to kind of talk about the Legco, because obviously in all the excitement, we haven't really gotten to it tonight. We're electing 11 members. If the lower house vote translates at all through to the Legco, we'd be seeing something like 4 or 5 Labor, at least 2 Liberal, at least 2 One Nation, a Green, and then the final seat being a fight between the Liberals, perhaps One Nation, or another kind of right-wing micro party, perhaps Family First. Carville, at the moment, Carville, there's been one more vote centre has come in, another fairly small one. We now have one candidate on 25% of the vote, and the rest still hanging around 20. So there's not really much more to add there, unfortunately.
I mean,
This is not bad for Schultz at the moment. You just need to be. You're an independent. You just need to be somewhere in the pack, and he's
if he's in the top 2, he's well positioned.
Yeah, I think he's. I might even, if he can hold that up for a bit longer, I might kick that out of my messy seat list as well. It looks pretty good at this stage, but we do have to wait and see what we've seen in the past with some of these independents doing disastrously on pre-polls, particularly the Finniss example last time, to see if they still stay in a competitive position.
I can say when I went down to Carville pre-poll, Matt Schultz was there, shook my hand, etc. So he was working the pre-poll booth. I can confirm.
Yeah, I'm back now, and I wanted to mention Unley because it gives us a little taste of how things used to work in Australian elections, in that it's mostly, I mean, there's a 15% Greens vote, but apart from that, it's mostly a two-party race, and it looks like another gain for Labor. You know, in the places where the One Nation vote isn't high enough to totally rewrite the rules of electoral politics, it is proving to be a landslide victory for Labor over Liberal. And I mean, I note that, well, I don't know, there's a lot of guesswork involved, but right now it seems like the estimate is that the 2PP, for what it's worth, which is not very much, is about 60%, which is about what the polls have been saying all year. So right now the polls are looking pretty good. But Unley is an example of one of those seats where Labor has gained one off the Liberals.
Can we just have a look at the seat next door of Bragg again?
Yeah, for sure. Bragg. Go for it.
I mean, if I see the Liberals on 41, Labor on 32.5, the Greens on 16, I think the Liberals are in a world of trouble there. With the caveat that pre-poll hasn't come in, that's looking quite tough. Interestingly, we don't have a preference count reporting yet, so this is all based off primaries and projections.
Yeah. So that will be again a pretty conventional two-party contest to watch. So there are a few of them. For those of you who like the retro style of politics, there will still be a few of those places for you, but it won't be the main thing.
No.
What I should probably stress is, in the big picture sense, how extraordinary what we're seeing here is historically, because normally this is one of my big theoretical pets, is federal drag, the theory that who's in power federally affects state elections and makes incumbents of the same party do worse. And we're seeing a federally dragged state government looking like it's going to make substantial, serious seat gains, and that basically historically does not happen for many decades. So the fracturing of the right and also the popularity of Peter Malinowski is producing this extreme outlier in election history. It's not. This is not like, Western Australia. The federal drag was the other way around. So it's quite an incredible thing to see.
I mean, we just had a commenter there asking, what does this imply for federal? And the federal polls haven't been the same as the state polls. Labor's been a bit lower. Both Liberal and One Nation are a bit higher. But I mean, you'd probably see something a little bit similar to this. I think that you would see probably Labor win the election, but you'd have this catastrophic split on the right.
I mean, dare I say, were we to hold a federal election tomorrow with the current kind of polling numbers, it would be even messier, I think, because at least here there is a clear first place, and that's the Labor Party, and they're going to govern for the next 4 years. But after that, it's a mess. Whereas I think we'd be seeing more of a mess at all levels were a federal election or a Victorian election perhaps held tomorrow. So maybe South Australia is just a test of the kind of messiness to come over the next 4 years.
I mean, and I think of all the state polls, because One Nation is having an effect everywhere. South Australia is the state where the Liberal Party has been looking the worst, and maybe it's a little bit unlucky for them that it's the one that's come first. But the federals are also, like, the feds are probably second worst in terms of how they're doing. You know, states where, I mean, Tasmania, where you have Herr Clark, you know, would probably handle a result like this a little bit better in terms of actually reflecting how people vote. And yeah, it would probably be a difficult one to deal with when it came time to form a government. But you know, the Liberal Party wouldn't be as devastated as they are right now. And then you have states like Queensland and Victoria where the Liberal Party is either in government or is being competitive for government, and it sort of means that they're able to withstand that trend a little bit more. But the Liberals are in South Australia are particularly hard hit.
Yeah, absolutely. And my kind of final point before I jump off is it's always important in South Australia for federal implications to remember that the National Party aren't really a thing. They're running three candidates this election in Flinders, where they're actually preferencing One Nation over the Liberals, Chafee and McKillop. They generally don't perform very well here. The parties merged historically, the Country Party and the Liberal Party, back in the 1930s. And so that's largely shaped why this is a rural backlash against the Liberal Party, and the Nationals are kind of nowhere to be seen for our kind of interstate counterparts. But Ben and Kevin, it's been great to be with you. This has been a great live stream. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Josh. Kevin, what seats are you looking at now? Let's go through any that jump
I
out
currently
at you.
have Chafee up on my screen because the One Nation has opened up a bit of a lead there. So I just that's a bit interesting. Seems from William's projection that the preference flow is not overwhelming to the Liberals at this stage, but it's rather hard to predict where these are going to end up with pre-polls and postals. So still, they may be in the hunt there, and I'll wait to see more of that.
Yeah, I mean, he's projecting a 2CP of 50-50.
Yeah, I don't know that that's going to hold up, but at least there's something there for One Nation, perhaps. I'd like to see some more votes from McKillop. We've been stalled on a handful of votes there for a very long time, gazing at the same pile of votes. The
I
point
recognise
that was
that everyone polling 2 votes. That was
yes,
we looked at that about an hour and a half ago. Yeah.
yeah, the point that was made about the sort of the prospect that One Nation will get underrepresented compared to the Liberals. On the current vote shares, the way it's going, One Nation is starting to drop a little bit below their polls, which tended to have them on 22, 23, and the Liberals are starting to come up a little bit above the polling. And there was a potential in the modelling that I did where I was seeing this kind of thing, even off the numbers that the polls were getting. The Liberals might win more seats than One Nation. One Nation might just be a bit unlucky with their vote being distributed such that some of their best seats were seats with Indies, some of their best seats were seats with Labor too far ahead, and they might end up dudded. But also the fact that it's not straight out primary votes. There are seats where Labor preferences come into play, and they have a problem with those seats. They're on a two-party preferred between them and the Liberals, they wouldn't be doing well. So I think that's partly what's going on there.
Yeah, I've been just looking at Stewart. I've just pulled Stewart up, if you can see that, Kevin. Again, another place where there might not be, well, almost certainly not going to be a major party in the 2CP. This has kind of snuck up on us. It's now an independent versus One Nation race. We're going to get independent versus Liberal preferences tonight. I think Brock is probably fine, but I wouldn't say that with certainty. And he will presumably do relatively well out of Labor preferences. I'd want to look at what the Liberal How to Vote said in Stewart, but that is one of interest.
Yeah, I'll see if I can bring up the Liberal How to find the Liberal How to Vote card on somewhere around here and see what did happen with that.
Look, if anyone in the comments knows what the Liberal How to Vote said in Stewart, let us know. I'll just check the comments to see whether there's any there. But yeah, we've got a couple of One Nation versus independent races here, and generally, I think the independent. This is one of the things that One Nation's going to face is that they're doing well enough to make the 2CP in a lot of seats, but generally, they don't. I think we'll find that they don't do as well out of preferences. Maybe in a Labor versus One Nation race with a lot of Liberal votes, they might do okay, but in a lot of places, they're the ones that are disadvantaged in the preference count. And so if they're against the Liberals have an advantage. If they're against an Independent, the Independent has an advantage. And so they end up polling substantially and not winning really many of them at all. But you know, I don't want to make it seem like they're right now they're leading in 4 seats, which is actually more than the Liberal Party now, according to Williams' computer. So that is, you know, there's a lot that we don't know about that, but I think the chances that they end up forming opposition are still quite serious.
Yeah, so the 3 One Nation leads. I mean, McKillop we need more numbers on, and the other two are pretty shaky, I would say. But we will see what happens when we get more numbers.
Chafee, Hammond, and Narunga.
So I haven't looked at Flinders for a while. So in Flinders, the independent charge is doing not very much, still not doing very much, and they're starting to be more substantial count at about 10%. So that does look like Liberal versus One Nation, and the Liberals might keep that one.
Yeah, I think the
looking at
Liberals
how many
have won,
seats the Liberals can win. Schubert, I think they're doing fine the last I checked. Oh, they're doing very fine in Schubert. Okay. Where else did the Liberals win seats? Chafee, possibly. That one, I think they're probably doing a bit better than the projection there. William is showing them as a heading 4. I'm struggling to find some of the others there.
So okay, so he's got them. Okay, so we said a minute ago One Nation was on 3, it was on 4, and Liberals were on 3. That's now reversed, which again shows us there are not many that have been called, and there's a lot of uncertainty here. Kevin, I've got a request for your opinion about Narunga, which William's computer is called. You can look at it on screen. I've pulled it up for everyone to look at.
Okay, like the current numbers, we do have an actual preference flow there that is. We have an actual preference flow that is independent versus Liberal. That's not very useful. So now Labor put Fraser Ellis last, so on that Labor and Ellis are getting knocked out, and the question then would be Labor and Ellis preferences to One Nation versus Liberals having to catch up from currently a long way behind. But yeah, there's some interest there. We may have to wait for that to be realigned to see how the preferences are flying, because the Labor preferences will favour Liberals. I'm not sure what the Fraser Ellis preferences will do.
Okay, it is 8:32 in South Australia, and we've got Jill Shepherd joining us now. Hello, Jill.
G'day, guys. G'day, Ben. Hi, Kevin.
Hello. I'm going to have to disappear for a while. I may still be here later on if you want me back later. But
sure. Feel free to just turn your mic and camera off if you want to come back a bit later. But
yeah, okay.
Thanks for joining us, Kevin.
I will do that. I may pop back later sometime. Bang, bang.
Jill, not much going on. It's pretty standard, boring stuff. Hey.
So, I mean, 2 things are happening simultaneously, right? And one is that, you know, when you look at these aggregate seat figures, it's disastrous for the Libs. You know, it's a tremendous result for Labor. But on the other hand, this is what we expected. And we know that these 3 CP counts that you talk about pretty regularly, you know, when we don't know who's going to be excluded first, this is a real problem for election night predictions. And we sort of predicted that as well. So, yeah, on the one hand, unprecedented stuff. On the same hand, all pretty much as we would have thought.
I would be surprised if more than half the seats at the end of the night we think we've got the right 2CP. Like there's a bunch where we don't know.
We don't talk about this much right? Because it's a very behind the scenes sort of thing the electoral commissions do, and that's that they have to before vote counting starts. They have to guess which two candidates they think will be in the top two. Now, traditionally, this has not been a problem. You go, oh, it's Labor and Liberal. You know, if it's a well-known independent, you say it's well-known independent and Liberal or Labor. And it's made their job a lot more political. And it means that behind the scenes right now, they're frantically trying to work out who might be excluded, even in the fourth round of counting, you know, the sort of fourth penultimate round of counting. That hasn't been something that they've had to worry about before. And it makes election night a lot drearier for people like you and me, but a hell of a lot more stressful for the electoral commissions themselves.
Yeah, I mean, someone was saying earlier, like, why do they bother with the 2CP? And I think it's still worth doing. Like, you could, you know, like, they do their best to guess who the top two would be. And this is partly made more difficult because One Nation has surged out of nowhere and is a lot harder to know where they're going to be in the top two. And you can argue the toss about whether there's some places they picked the wrong top two. You could alternatively do a 3CP everywhere. But there's also places where that would get you less useful information. And I think sometimes it's just, we're just not going to know as much on election night, and there's going to be a bunch of seats where there's going to be a bit more guesswork.
But we're used to knowing on election night, and that's the problem that we all face at this point in time, is that we can't necessarily tell you on election night. I am increasingly only fixated on primary vote, and the primary vote right now in this you know, the booths that have come in so far tell us pretty much what we would expect. There is a swing against Labor, but we will still call this a landslide for Labor. Because they have managed, like they have at the federal level, to win the vast majority of seats. Labor, increasingly as a campaign organisational unit, is very good at turning votes into seats where it matters. And the Libs federally and at the state levels haven't been able to match that lately. One Nation, you know, you see a further behind again in terms of being able to turn votes into seats. They've obviously got this groundswell of support. It's an 18.1% swing at the moment on the ABC's computer, but they may turn that into one or two seats in the lower house. So, you know, they're really struggling still to really maximise the return on investment for these election campaigns.
I'm interested in whether this is a reflection of Labor being an effective campaign unit in terms of where their vote is, or if it just reflects that when a party has like a 16-point lead in this sort of system, you know, unless the preferences really go against them hard, that they're gonna benefit. You know, that they're gonna win a lot of seats because there's kind of a progressive majority in a lot of places, even if it's not a big majority. And so when you don't need 45-50% of the vote to win, like, you know, they're just first, and they're first a lot, and they're first everywhere, and so they end up in a lot of seats. And I'm not sure I agree that is a reflection of their. I mean, getting 37% of the vote might be a reflection of their campaign strategy and effectiveness, but I'm not sure they're necessarily achieving that efficiency through campaign strategy.
Josh talked on this earlier, right? The idea of like sort of electoral fairness in electoral districting in South Australia. I think, you know, we sort of agonise over boundaries everywhere. Obviously, there's a massive incumbency advantage. You are the premier, you are the sitting member. We tend to figure you add a 2 or 3% percentage point boost just by virtue of being there already. But, you know, you're old enough, Ben, like me, to remember 2004 to 2007 federally, and the massive turnaround in both vote and seat share from those elections, and then you end up with Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister. Like, it's absolutely doable. Maybe I'm a little bit too Pollyanna-ish on Labor's recent ability to campaign pretty well. But I think what we're seeing here, you know, you've got One Nation on 20% of the primary vote at the moment projected. But they may well not be able to turn that into a lower house seat, and that's not good. You know, you and I have talked a lot about this, about the proportionality of the electoral system, but even just as a reflection on the party as a campaign unit, it's not a great reflection. What seats are you looking at? Because no one ever asks you, Ben. You ask everyone else.
I mean, there's so many. It does feel like we're in that stage of there's results flying over your head and you reach out and you grab one. I'm kind of trying to go through and get a bit of a sense of the seats that I haven't really looked at. I was just looking at Badco, where we haven't really looked very much at that, but it's pretty safe. I realise I haven't looked at Elizabeth in a little while. Elizabeth is an interesting one. Let me pull that one up.
The chat was very excited about Elizabeth earlier.
Yeah. So that is one where you've got One Nation 6.7 points behind Labor on primary votes. This is one where the sitting Labor MP retired, and so the Labor vote has dropped a lot. And this is an area where, Labor has been hit by the One Nation wave. And so we don't have a correct 2CP in Elizabeth. But I think Labor is probably the one that wins there, but they're going to have to do a recount to find out. And Williams' estimate is 53% Labor, and that feels a little bit too close for comfort, which is why he's got it as Labor ahead. But if Labor was to lose a seat to One Nation, that would be really fascinating. And I think we haven't seen any solid cases of that yet. Mostly One Nation is hitting rural Liberals and independents too a little bit, but yeah.
We've sort of seen this in polling, but we haven't had firm evidence of it, right? But you are seeing a massive swing to One Nation on primary polls and a slight swing away from Labor that is massively dwarfed by the swing away from the Libs. At the same time, you've got leaders like Malinauskas and Albanese saying, well, it's a fringe party, we don't need to worry about it too much. But I do worry that, well, I don't worry because I don't care in a partisan sense, but, I do wonder whether those sort of glib remarks help to chip away at Labor's kind of dam wall against a party like One Nation. I think there are voters who, and we know this from things like the election study, there are voters who would otherwise vote Labor, who right now are looking to One Nation, not necessarily as a party on the right that they would normally vote for, but as an anti-system party, a party that wants to do things a little bit differently. Maybe you call them populist. I think that's, probably a bit overused, but the idea of a party that's just outside of the duopoly, and One Nation's there ready to take their votes. I think a lot of us were looking at this election as a kind of canary in the coal mine, right? Like, can One Nation actually parlay this polling into electoral results? And I think they'll probably do okay. They're not. They may scrape to opposition, but if unless you can turn that polling into votes in the lower house, then you're not really playing where the major parties are.
Well, yeah, except they're playing just as well as one of the major parties right now. I think,
but not in the house that matters, right? I think that's really important. So even in Elizabeth, and we'll be talking about this, and this came up in the seat where Stuart Bond did quite well for One Nation in the federal election. I can't remember which seat it was in the Hunter. They get close, right? They get close a lot, and we talk about it a lot on election night, and then the next day we sort of forget about it. And the unfortunate thing about our system, as Josh said earlier, is it's majoritarian, and if you don't win, then you don't take anything home.
So I'm curious about how they go. If One Nation won 10 seats, then the question would become, how do they go in Parliament? Like, that would become interesting to watch. But the polls have really shown there was some skepticism from people going, like, they won't get that vote. They'll implode. They won't be able to find good candidates. And I mean, they had a candidate issue in the last couple of days that was pretty bad. And I think the lesson we take away is maybe they've done a little bit better with candidate selection than they've in the past, a little bit. But frankly, like, their voters don't really care, right? The voters are happy to vote for the Hanson party, even though Hanson's not on the ballot. And that could change if they win a bunch of seats and there's a bunch of other randos in Parliament. But I think, if you thought, I've had a few people in the last few days with a lot of wishful thinking going, oh, there's no way, like, they're not going to be at all competitive in the federal election. I think this shows that that they will be, that, like, things might change, but right now they are in an impactful position. I mean, we talked about one of the things that's making this a bit simpler tonight is that Labor is so far out in front that even though there's a bunch of seats we can't. I've been going through some of the less interesting seats in the last few minutes, and there's a bunch of seats where we don't know who the top two is, but Labor's so far out in front that they've won. You know, Malinowski's a seat of Croydon, for example.
And there was chat earlier in the comments on the YouTube stream about, like, you know, how can you call 4 seats before countings, you know, before we've got a significant amount of votes in, and it's because there are these seats where we just know, like, and we talk about this a lot behind the scenes too, right? This sort of probabilistic not declaration because that sounds like we're the Electoral Commission, but, you know, probabilistic calling of seats. And we know that there's enough votes coming in, and we may put a sort of margin of error around the number of seats that we think Labor in this case has. We may say it's 4 plus or minus 2. And so the ABC computer, and I'm not sure how Will Bow does it, but the ABC computer will say there's probably 4 seats. We can't tell you which 4 seats they are, but we reckon there's 4 on the basis of probabilities.
Why don't we go back and look at a few seats here? Hyson, I've just been going through alphabetically, frankly, and looking at Hyson that is not loading. There it is. It's, you know, it's one of these ones where One Nation is in 4th place on 17%, and it looks like it's Greens and Labor competing for who comes second, who then challenges Liberal for the win. Labor does seem to have extended their lead over the Greens a little bit, and actually the 2CP Labor is winning against the Liberals. We're probably going to need a 3CP count here. But you know, I wouldn't rule any of them out at this point. It looks like all 3 could potentially win that seat.
Yeah, and that order of exclusion that we've never really had to think about too much, and that Kevin touched on earlier, is so incredibly important. And I'm going to go back to another federal seat because it's the one that you and I have talked about before, the seat of Ryan in the last federal election. That is quite a conservative seat in the area of sort of Greater Brisbane, or inner Brisbane really. That was the one that the Greens held on to after the May 2025 election. And they really did that because Labor was excluded first. And once Labor was excluded, a lot of those Labor preferences went to the Green candidate over the Liberal candidate. So the more left-wing party gets elected in the more conservative seat. And that's always going to be a problem for Labor, is that if they are excluded early. Now, I think in Hyson at the moment, you know, they're well ahead of One Nation. They should stay ahead of the Greens. Pre-polls don't tend to favour left-wing parties. There's still about a 2 percentage point boost across the board to Conservative parties from pre-polls. And so I think that it's going to come down to a 2PP, a Labor versus Liberal final count. But it's close, right? Like when I jumped on the stream, you know, the Electoral Commissions aren't prepared for these sorts of counts. This is Corwell-esque, you know, in terms of the 4 different ways this could go.
So I pulled up Carvel here, which Josh Sunman was our local Carvel expert, but he's no longer with us, and has been warning us to wait for Mount Barker, and we've got a primary vote for one of the booths in Mount Barker.
Oh, is that in?
It is one of the booths in Mount Barker has come in. There's a few to look at. There's 3 booths in Mount Barker, and we've got one, and it has the independent substantially ahead, but like nowhere near a majority. It is still, we would want a 4CP here to be sure. And I think, you know, Schultz is winning over Labor very comfortably. You know, probably this is a situation where he wins against all comers, and this is, you know, this is how you.
We should specify though, he's winning in a notional 2CP. He's not winning massively on the primary count at the moment. On the primary count, he's not less than 3% ahead.
Yeah, and but I would say he's likely to be in the 2CP because
he should be, right.
He's got a little bit of a lead over the others. But it's so complex. Like I'm noting down some seats where I think we would need a 3CP, and I'm ignoring the ones where there are a bunch of seats where we don't know who the top 2 are, but the winner is so far out in front that doesn't matter. But this one, I'm like, what I want here is a 4CP.
Yeah, absolutely. And pre-polls
Yeah.
still to come. This is very trite to say, you know, pre-polls still to come, but they are. And as I said, they tend to be a little bit more conservative. Now, we don't know if pre-polls tending to be more conservative lends itself to favouring One Nation. That's something that we just don't have data on before this election, and it's going to be really informative as we go through to more state and federal elections. But if you figure it's probably worth about 1 percentage point to the Lib candidate, Bradley Orr, then he's almost neck and neck with One Nation, and you don't know who gets knocked out of those first. It might not matter too much in terms of preference flow from One Nation and Liberal to the Independent over the Labor Party candidate. But who knows? Maybe there are Liberal Party voters in that block of 19.2 at the moment % of the votes that have been counted that prefer Labor to the Independent candidate. I don't know how realistic that is, but and again, it's really trite to say, but it's uncharted territory, right?
Yeah, it's it's uncharted. I mean, I'm going through seats that we haven't looked at yet, and I'm still finding seats that are really interesting and complex. Here, the seat of Light, we've got Labor on 37, One Nation on 33. So pretty clear that it's going to be those two in the top two. We got 5 out of 13 booths, but they've picked the wrong 2CP. Like they've picked Labor versus Liberal there.
Yeah. So just look at the primary.
Yeah. So we're not going to get that one tonight, and we don't really know much about how those preferences are going to flow. Like that data is, Williams made a guess, and it's currently giving Labor 50.6% 2CP, which is far too close for it to be anything you could predict. So
Ben, what's Will got on the 2CP? I'm on the ABC site. I'd like to compare.
You can, if you look at the live stream there, it's got a 50.6 2CP for Labor, the little pie chart on the right, which is nothing. Like it's very close.
Okay. But ABC is a little bit more bullish on Labor versus the One Nation candidate, Alex Banks.
Yeah.
But, this is, and it's a bit of a sort of how the sausage is made, but there are points with the ABC computer where we do hit a big button and say, this doesn't feel right. But we do that on the basis of gut feel and data from existing elections, right? And this seat of Light here is one where the One Nation candidate has had a 26% swing to him. The Libs have had almost 10 against him, and Labor had 20% against him. So you've got, I'm going to be sort of a bit crude in my roundings here, but above a quarter of the vote has shifted to One Nation, and about 2/3 of that has come from Labor. And we don't know how that we don't know, like, we can make projections all we want, but we don't know who those voters are, and they're not people that we have enough data on at this point in time to predict.
Yeah. I'm looking at McKillop here. I'll pull McKillop up. One Nation has a big lead, and then Liberal is just slightly ahead of Nick McBride, the Independent, for second place. So you effectively have three Conservatives competing here. And
these are the most interesting seats for mine. I just had a friend text me and say, "Who is Nick McBride? Who is Nick McBride? What do we know about him?" She's a journalist. We don't really know, and I don't think anyone was expecting these sorts of three-cornered contests. But if One Nation can stay ahead of, the Independent, which at current counting they absolutely can, then they likely get elected.
Yeah, another one here. Again, you might notice an alphabetical trend here, but we're just going through. We now have a lot to look at. And Mawson here, we got 3 candidates between 25 and 30%. Yeah.
What would you do? Like you and I have both been in this business a little bit about, projecting on the basis of very small numbers. Like, what's your gut feel on a seat like Mawson now?
I think, look, this is probably one where I would think that Labor's probably not going to win. I would look at that and go, Liberal or One Nation, one of them will come out on top, and they'll probably benefit from the other one's preferences. This looks like a bit of a reverse of Ryan.
Yes.
And you know, so this one is interesting, but again, like we don't have much data to go on. We don't have much of a formula, and so, you know, ideally this seat would have a 3CP instead. But then again, the 3CP would only give you so much. I mean, there is a benefit if you have 3CPs. If you were to do a 3CP everywhere, you would then be able to then apply preference flows from 3CP to 2CP, which is much more standardized than looking at primaries where there's different candidates everywhere, because you just look at Labor versus Liberal versus One Nation.
Yes, when you have preference flows from previous elections to model, right? And we don't. Not to this extent. You know, we do. We have preference flows that we can model when One Nation gets 6% of the vote, which they have for, you know, elections over the last 6 years. But when One Nation is getting 27% of the vote, as they currently are, in Mawson, then we don't know who these voters are, and we don't know how those preference flows will shake out. Now, Josh referred to, you know, how to vote cards and people using open preferencing earlier in the night, but even among established parties, voters following how to vote cards is declining massively. The last I checked, it was under like 40% of voters following preferences in a strict order. Voters are more than ever going on gut feel, and I wouldn't be confident saying that, for instance, if One Nation can creep up 2 percentage points or 3 percentage points like they would need to here to get in front of Labor, and then the Libs are knocked out, say, and One Nation's ahead, you know, who do these Liberal Party voters preference, Labor or One Nation?
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, I genuinely don't know. My guess would be maybe 60-40 One Nation over Labor. But there's a lot of those voters who are still Liberal, haven't defected to One Nation yet, who are not quite ready, I think, to move to a party like One Nation.
Well, these are the ones that haven't flipped, and the other ones have.
Yeah, exactly. So the Liberal voters that have remained are like qualitatively different to the ones who've already jumped ship to One Nation.
Nadjeri, I will pull that one up. That one also looks interesting, where you have Labor probably in third place. I think that's pretty, I wouldn't say safe, but likely. Liberal has a decent lead over One Nation. So I think probably Liberal are the ones likely to win. And that's what William's computer is saying. But we don't have the correct 2CP because we've got a Liberal versus Labor 2CP here. So, you know, that's one where, you know, maybe One Nation does better out of those Labor preferences. I think Labor preferences probably favour the Liberal Party in that case. But, you know, we're going to get a lot of really useful data in seats like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
this is going to get used federally.
This is the trial run as much as anything, right? Yeah, Labor has had a swing to them here, which is interesting. They've managed to hold up against this sort of conservative swing. The rise in One Nation vote has come almost entirely from loss to the Liberal Party vote. And so what we would expect from that, at least sort of prima facie, is that the kinds of voters who are voting One Nation are just conservative. You know, they're not disaffected major party voters en masse. These are conservative voters who want the Libs to be a little bit more conservative right now.
So I'm going through my list here, trying to identify who are the top two in each seat. And there's a bunch where we don't know. And there's a few here that I still need to go over. But right now, there are 9 that I've counted that are Labor versus Liberal. And there are 12 that I've counted which are Labor versus One Nation.
That's nuts.
And there are 16 where it's hard to say. I can't say right now. there's one independent versus One Nation, that's Mount Gambier, and there's 4 that are Liberal versus One Nation, and then there are 5 others. So one of the things that's happening here is if Labor's vote was a bit lower, there'd be a lot more of those Liberal One Nation contests, and a lot more of those Labor One Nation contests could be competitive. One Nation is coming second in a lot of places where Labor is winning comfortably. Like looking at those 12 seats, most of them are Labor wins. Like they're largely places where it's not really. I mean, Elizabeth, Giles, Newland, I've got down, and Light, I've got down here as interesting. I haven't looked at Giles in a while. Maybe we should pull up Giles.
This was something else This is something else that we talked about. Sorry, Ben, just to, on that point, before we move on that point of Labor being just enough percentage points ahead across the board that these seats aren't becoming Liberal versus One Nation. We made the same observation about the federal election too, right? There were so many seats where Labor crept into the 2CP somewhere between 1 and 5 percentage points ahead of the Libs. And once they were in that 2CP, you know, their two-party preferred went through the roof. And I think they're going to find the same thing here, is that if their support across the board was 3 percentage points lower, their seat share looks a lot worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of these things where the non-proportional way that this works is going to means that like small changes in vote cause dramatic changes in seat counts. I mean, we've seen large changes in vote to be clear here.
Oh, this is enormous. The Liberal in Giles has lost half his vote.
But the difference between federal and South Australia is that both the right-wing parties have a little bit of a higher vote and the Labor vote is lower. So it is, the federal polls right now are exactly that scenario you're talking about. And like, again, it's 2 years away. Who knows what might happen? Maybe getting a big vote and not winning many seats might puncture burst the bubble, or it might like give them more of a drive. I don't know, but it's like right now, federal polls I think point to something a bit like this, but without such a big Labor overperformance. And I don't think it's necessarily the case that like if the overall right vote was a bit bigger, you could see a situation where the left-right split is very close while having a lot of chaos within the two camps, right? And that is the kind of scenario where you just don't know who forms government on the night.
I think the big question is how much we think the One Nation vote is a right vote and how much of it is anti-major party vote. And I'm flip-flopping all the time, right? Like, I see plenty of people who look like they should be Labor voters insisting that they will only vote for One Nation. And like, yes, that's extremely anecdotal and it's against all of my kind of empirical instincts. But it's also really important, I think, to appreciate. And that's why I said earlier, like, when Malinauskas and Albanese talk about this as being extreme or not mainstream, or a protest vote, I'm looking at these numbers, dude, and there's 27% swing towards the One Nation candidate in Giles, and you go, okay, he's getting a third of the primary vote. That's by definition mainstream, right?
Yeah. Sorry for all the keyboard clicking, but that's how an election night goes. I'm looking through alphabetically or up to Torrens here, and Labor's on 40% in Torrens, and there's a 25% One Nation vote. So probably, I mean, Williams called it for Labor, but that's a place where those numbers have changed a little bit. While I've been looking at it, there must have been a booth. Yeah, I was looking at it from 5 minutes ago and it was 2 booths, now it's 4. Labor has a pretty substantial lead there. We don't know who the second will be. Probably it's One Nation. But we're seeing a lot of these kinds of seats where, One Nation is coming second, but they're not anywhere near winning.
And this is a real like for like kind of, the Liberal candidates lost 18.2% on the swing, and One Nation's picked up 19.9 from nowhere. So you'd say that's pretty like for like. That a Family First candidate is running again, and he's lost some vote from last time. So there's a little bit of churn, but certainly in some of these seats, and these sort of we call them differential swings, right? And that's not just in terms of the numbers that are swinging from seat to seat, but the kinds of voters who are swinging from seat to seat. Sometimes that's because you've got, a kick-ass local member. Not as often as you'd think, though. Often it is just demographics, and people watching will have come across the idea of MRP polls, so multi-level regression post-stratification polls. And what they try to do is pick up that relationship between social and cultural kind of characteristics. What kind of jobs do people do in these electorates? How much money do they make? How educated are they? And vote choice, and say, okay, if we know that people who don't have university degrees are swinging towards One Nation, and that this seat has 40% of voters without university degrees, we can predict that in this seat specifically, we'll see a swing to One Nation. And that's what MRP does pretty successfully. I'm a big proponent of MRPs. And that's what we're seeing as we click through these seats right now, is that, a seat like Torrens, you are seeing a like-for-like swap from Libs to One Nation. And that's telling you something about the kinds of voters who are in this seat.
So I've just finished a bit of a data set here. We have no data from Enfield, but before I finish that, I would say the MRPs will get better once we have more solid preference data. That we will have a better sense of, particularly going from the 3CP to the 2CP, who wins in a particular kind of scenario. Admittedly, that'll be South Australian data, but it's the best we've got. It'll be much more useful than, it would be better if we had federal comparison. But I think on the primary votes, I think the MRPs are probably, I rate them. I think they're pretty good. I think the biggest weakness is preferences, which is a weakness.
And that's all polls. I think on everything, we just need to look at primaries right now. And, and look, and, mea culpa, that's where I came a bit unstuck in May last year, because I said, well, Labor's doing no good on the primaries, right? They can't possibly parlay this into a majority government. And they did. So that's probably why I'm a bit bullish on them as campaigners. But, you're right. There's two problems with MRPs. One is that they don't necessarily help with preferencing, especially in this kind of multi-party environment. And B, we just don't have very good, well-calibrated data yet on who votes One Nation. We have okay data on who votes Greens, and they've been, a staple presence for 35 years. But with the One Nation vote so in flux, we can't make good predictions about, voters with a high school degree, high school education only will definitely vote One Nation. We can't say that with enough certainty yet.
Okay, so I have a little bit more data here where I've been pulling together the estimates, and some of this data might be a bit old, but I find there are 8 classic seats in the state right now out of 47.
That's incredible.
There are some others that might end up in that category, but right now there are only 8 that are clearly in that category. That's 8 out of 47 seats. The Labor versus One Nation, there are 16 seats that are Labor versus One Nation. And again, that's about a third of the state where it's clearly Labor versus One Nation. Amongst those, I have a light is a total, not really sure what's going on there, seat right now. Where, like we said, we don't have any 2CP. Labor is ahead of One Nation, but it's competitive, and most of those Labor is winning. A lot of them Labor is winning by a lot. Then we have 5 Liberal versus One Nation seats, and most of them we don't have a lot of data for. And then we have 2 Independent versus One Nation seats. We've got Mount Gambier and Stewart. Then we have 15 seats that are complex, where it's looking like we don't know who the top 2 are. In 5 of those, I've listed that I think we need 5 of those 15. I think we need a 3CP or a 4CP. And then there is but the rest of those, the other 10 of those, are Labor is way out in front, and we don't know who is second. So it's of academic interest, but it doesn't matter for the result. So there's so many of these. And then Enfield, I don't know what's going on in Enfield. We have no results for Enfield.
Enfield has started to trickle in, but it's...
Oh, has it?
Yeah.
Last time I checked, there was nothing. Okay, we've got 4 boos for Enfield. Enfield is Labor. It's another Labor first. We don't know who is second. Labor win.
I'm looking at Will Bow's projected 3CP, and it's ugly. I mean, yeah.
It's so I guess the zooming out from that, the picture here is that like Labor is in the race in the top 2 in most places. There are quite a few seats where we don't know who the top 2 are, but there are 5 that seem to really matter, where we genuinely don't know who the top 2 are. And those 5 are McKillop, Finnis, Hyson, Mawson, and Carville. And Carville is one where last time I checked anyway, I'll keep checking those. I think we need a 4CP. Like that's the one where the independent is in front. So there's a lot of that.
Carville, yeah.
The other thing to note here is there are only 12 seats where the 2CP seems to be correct right now, out of 47. So it's about a quarter of the state where the 2CP is telling us what we like, is giving us the correct preference count.
So this is a bit of sort of inside baseball, but the Electoral Commission will have handed its expected 2CPs, and when we say expected 2CPs, we mean the 2 candidates that it thinks will be in the running at the end of the night to the ABC. And increasingly, that, having worked with the ABC for a few years now, that list is increasingly wrong. And it's not a problem because, and as you said earlier in the stream too, Ben, it's not their fault. This is not sort of the game that they're in. But for voters who are sitting at home waiting for really clear predictions, it is a massive problem.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if you had a federal election on these numbers, a federal election with these dynamics but with federal numbers, you would come out the other side saying, we don't know. I think you'd come out of election night going, we don't know who's going to form government.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think increasingly...
and there might be a thing where there's... Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, increasingly, I think election night won't be about prediction and projection. It will just be primary vote. And then the House of Reps count will become more like a Senate count, where it just takes place over the successive week. And we know by Wednesday or Thursday.
So why don't we sum up where we're at? It is 9:11 p.m. in South Australia. We have 23% of the vote counted. Labor is on just under 38% of the vote. One Nation is second on 21%, and the Liberal Party is on 19%. The Greens are on 12%. Right now, those numbers look a lot like the polling figures. The polls seem to have done pretty well at picking where things were at, which is Labor well out in front, but down a little bit from the last election. One Nation narrowly ahead of the Liberal Party. The Greens up a little bit, but not competitive. In terms of seats, there are a lot of places where we don't know who has won, but we are certain that Labor will form a majority government. Labor is benefiting from the fact that they have a lead in a lot of places. So even though their vote is not huge, generally, if it's Liberal, they're against, they're winning. If it's One Nation against, they're winning. There are not many places which are Liberal versus Labor. There are less than a quarter of the state that fit that category. There are also a bunch of places where we don't even know who the top 2 are, and we won't know that tonight. So there's a few places where we will probably get preference counts over the next few days, and then there are a handful of seats where it will probably be weeks before we know, and that's putting aside seats where we might know exactly who the top 2 are, and the race is too close to know for sure.
There's 2 really interesting points from that. One is, and it's not something that we've talked about at all really, that Malinowskis has done quite well at winning the centre. Everyone I talk to in South Australia, Adelaide-based journos and South Australian-based family tell me how centrist Malinowskis is, and I know that's sort of a bit of a cliche at this point, but I think it probably bears repeating. He's done really well winning back those suburban seats that Josh was referring to earlier. These were massive, we say blue ribbon seats, but we used to talk about Kooyong and Higgins as blue ribbon seats, and they're gone. But those inner suburban, really wealthy seats in Adelaide that seem to be gone now for the Libs, that Malinauskas has targeted really effectively. And the second is that number, that like diminishing number of seats that are Labor versus Liberal in a two-party system, notionally. That's really, that's genuinely interesting stuff. Now, I think this is a blip. And I think you probably, we've talked about this a bit before, right? We think this is sort of the two blocks on the right and left, realigning slightly, but they will work themselves out in due course. But if you were to explain to someone from overseas, or an alien just landed on Earth, what's going on with this party system, it doesn't look like a two-party system.
No, I think if this was a federal election, I think one of the things we'd be looking at here is there's a bunch of seats which we know who someone's won, but then there'd be a bunch where we're like, this is a left block seat. We don't know if Labor will win or Greens will win. This is a right block seat. We don't know if the Liberal or One Nation will win. And I think the preference flows are showing that parties are moving into those two separate camps, even if often the politicians don't particularly appreciate it. Labor and the Greens don't get along, but their voters kind of push them together. I might, if you're okay, Jill, to give your thoughts on something for a minute, I'm going to turn my camera off for a second, and I'll be back in a few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. I might just sort of flick through the seats. Actually, what I've been really keen to do is to compare the poll bludger and the ABC computers to see how they're going, because it's sort of an intellectual exercise and not something that I've had time to do as yet tonight. I talked a little bit about the behind the scenes of how the ABC computer operates, and traditionally there was not necessarily a manual override, but a sense that if in certain seats you got to 35% of the primary vote, you were good, because we were confident enough about preference flows that at that point you could confidently call the seat on a two-party preferred basis. In some seats, that's had to go up to 40% because preference flows are becoming more fragmented. Fewer people, as I said earlier, are using how to vote cards. So there's more leakage from a major party to minor parties, or vice versa, from minor parties to major parties. And so it's harder to tell where those votes are going to end up. But what we're looking at now in a lot of these seats that we're calling really confidently for one party over another is, primary votes of less than 35%, even statewide. And it's another instance like the last federal election where, Labor's going to win this in a landslide. They're doing it on a primary vote of not much over a third of the electorate. This, to me, is a genuine sort of fragmentation in how the party system is working in Australia. I don't think that we're necessarily going to lose the two-party system. I think that Labor and Liberal are too well entrenched to get rid of now in terms of governing dominance. But it really changes the way that we predict, and it changes the way that I think voters understand elections. You don't have to win. You don't have to win a massive primary vote anymore, right? To win a landslide.
So we've got a few people talking about, our preference is broken, arguing that they're not. And the thing for me is, I think often it is the best outcome for one seat, but a lot of this becomes very arbitrary about the order of elimination of candidates. You could see a lot of small changes in the vote flipping a lot of seats because of that. And so, back when it was mostly a two-party system, you were making a choice about who that top two was, even if you weren't voting for them. Labor or the coalition, you might vote for the Greens or you might vote for the DLP or whatever, but you had that choice. But I think it's going to become even less proportional. And I think people could ignore the proportionality as long as you had a bit of there's two sides, and the side that's on top wins, and the side that's...
And it rotates.
Yeah.
Right? You may get 2 or 3 terms at a time, but the other party will get their turn.
Whereas I think, and I think there's a lot of smug Australians who compare us to the UK with first past the post, where their system does a very poor job of representing people voting. But I think preferential voting, and I was having this argument with a Australian journo based in Beijing on social media about this the other day, and I was saying I don't think introducing preferential voting would help the UK that much, because it would still lead to situations where parties can win huge majorities on barely a third of the vote. Probably the Starmer government would have won by even more in 2024 if they'd had preferential voting. And I could see how maybe you could argue that it would help a progressive majority defeat Reform, who have that benefit of being there's one right-wing party that's bigger and a bunch of small left-wing parties. But I just think
the big thing it does is allows people to vote for a minor party or independent candidate without loss, right? So you can go vote for One Nation even if you don't think they're necessarily going to form government. And that vote isn't thrown away. And my argument is that in the Australian election context, that's meant that when voters are ready to withdraw from the major parties, and probably 2022 was we called it the watershed in the book that we've both contributed to. But I think what was so important about that watershed moment in 2022 and now in South Australian election is that voters have muscle memory for voting for independent and minor parties. And that's something that first past the post in the UK doesn't really allow for, right? Because if you've been voting Green or Lib Dem to a lesser extent, and now Reform, everywhere, and it's all anyone talks about with regards to UK politics, but they've still got 4 members or something in their House of Commons. They're not a massive force. But when you have that muscle memory of voting for one, for independent and minor party candidates, I think it makes the watershed moment easier, and that's a good thing. But you're right, substantively, it's not probably going to change the composition in any legislature.
You reminded me, actually, there was a question. We had a period earlier where we had no results and we were taking questions, and someone was asking about election books, and it reminded me actually that the other day I got a copy from Mark Riboldi, who was also one of the authors on the latest book, of the 1987 election book that he found on a colleague's bookshelf that they were clearing out. And so we have this great new book that's come out that you're one of the editors for, Jill, called Landslide, about the 2025 federal election. This is the one before that 2022 watershed that you just mentioned. That is I find really interesting. I've been kind of collecting the old ones because it does such a great job of capturing all the different angles of an election. So if you want that, you don't have to buy the paper one unless you really want to, but the
it's free. It's free to download.
Free online, and there's now 6 in a row that are all free on the ANU Press website. So I've got a chapter in there, and Jill, you have I assume you have at least one chapter yourself, but there's also...
I only have one chapter, but I co-edited it. But Ben, Your chapter, this is just us blowing smoke up each other at this point of the night. But your chapter on specifically the decline of the major party vote share federally, I quote all the time. And I think it's everyone's go-to. Oh God, this is so obnoxious, isn't it? But it's most people's go-to on quantifying and showing empirically that decline in the major party vote share, because it's tremendous. And we're seeing this now. I mean, this is, to go back to South Australia, this is insane. What are we looking at? We're talking about this very calmly, this is just a normal state election, and it's not, right? This is objectively a really weird Australian election.
Yeah, but it's not. It's a shock in some ways, but it's not a surprise.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's completely right. It's a great testament to polling. I'm right now on the seat of Badco, where we don't have many results yet, only 2 booths out of 15. But the Greens are getting another really good swing. And I think when we read all of the coverage tomorrow morning, no one will talk about the Greens, but they're doing quite well. At worst, they're suffering 1 or 2 percentage points against them, but in plenty of seats, they're doing great.
Yeah, Yeah, and it's one of those things where the story becomes very much about who ends up winning that seat. So I think we've entered a bit of a lull at this point in the night. The votes are still coming in. I don't think we've really seen pre-poll anywhere, but I think the list of seats we're interested in is starting to shrink. In that it's probably worth going through some of these ones. There's about 25 that are of some interest, but I think a lot of them, if we were to look at them again, would become clear. I mean, Badco is one that is a pretty conventional close race. No, it's not a conventional close race. I've got it here as Labor.
Absolutely Labor.
Leading. Yeah, Labor's won that.
Labor Greens, but Greens getting a swing to them, and like not insubstantial. 8 percentage points right now.
Yeah, well, that was one that I had earlier as a Labor Liberal contest, but it's now, it could be Labor Greens, it could be Labor One Nation. That's one less classic seat.
Yeah, one fewer classic seat, but not in the way that like a swing against the tide, right?
Yeah. Then we got Bragg. We could just do a bit of a run of the board of a few of these. It's a pretty conventional Labor Liberal contest. Liberal has a lead. Williams called it for the Liberals, which I think is probably right. Liberal likely. I mean, I haven't looked at Hartley in ages, but I'm pretty sure that one's locked down as a Labor win. Yes, very comfortably. Labor's on 58.1%. That's the seat that was held by Vincent Tarzia, who was the Liberal leader to the end of last year. Yep. But again, though, Labor's winning on 37% of the vote. There's quite a big. I think we'll see in the centre of Adelaide. This is kind of a central Adelaide seat. There's a 16% Greens vote. They're not quite
with a 3 percentage point swing.
Yeah,
it's not a massive endorsement of Jen Roberts, the Labor candidate.
Yeah, and then we've got Morphett is one I haven't looked at in a while. Again, conventional Labor Liberal contests. Labor's on 54. Williams called that. I think that is probably one.
Gee, that's a close two-candidate preferred, though, if that comes down to Liberal and Labor, which it almost certainly will.
It is, yeah. It's a classic seat. And
the Greens have had a swing against them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know what that might be about. And then we got Elizabeth. We haven't looked at Elizabeth in a while. This is one of those ones where we just need a new 2CP, and Labor is leading, but just need correct 2CP.
Yeah, I'm much less confident of Labor winning this. This could be One Nation's big shot at winning a lower house seat. But again, we don't know enough about these remaining Liberal voters. It's only 5% because they've lost 12 percentage points on the primary swing. But if those 243 voters on 8 booths out of 13, if they really hate One Nation, and that they may well, then the ALP picks that up easily. If they're more conservative, if they're much less concerned about One Nation's sort of anti-system rhetoric, then that goes to One Nation. That could flip. I think that's going to go back and forward. If we had the New York Times needle, it would be, oscillating wildly. Can we go back to Carville?
We can go back to Carville, but we've also got another guest joining us. Rob, welcome to.
Is it Rob Manwaring?
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody.
It is 9:27 in South Australia. Let's look at Carville quickly, and then Rob, I'll come to you with your overall thoughts. Carville, Matt Schultz isn't quite in the lead anymore. Liberals are kind of fading a little. Starting to look a bit like a 5-horse race rather than a 4-horse race. But this is looking very Colwell-y with the Independent probably the favourite.
I'm going to tap out now and let Rob Manwaring deal with Carville because this is a mess.
Yeah. Thanks, Jill. Thanks for joining us for the last hour.
Thanks so much, Ben. And Rob, have fun. Yes, I'm leaving everyone in very good hands.
Thanks, Jill. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. What's your take overall on how things are going?
Good evening, Ben, and look, thanks for having me on the show. It's I've heard a couple of expressions about what we're seeing tonight, but I think political earthquake is probably not an unreasonable comparison. I mean, I think in one sense it's probably even more seismic than the collapse of the state bank in 1993, and then the sort of devastating loss for the Labour Party in sheer numbers of votes. And I think what we're seeing, I think, here is the sort of new currents, the new changes in Australian politics being kind of playing out at a kind of state level. So of course we have this massive landslide win, according to Treasurer Tom Coutts-Tonis, is like probably the largest Labour win in terms of seat share that they've ever had, in terms of the result. So this huge kind of political earthquake. But then of course you have, I'm sure what you've been talking about all tonight, is the one nation kind of factor and the implosion of the Liberals. And that strikes me there's quite a significant series of kind of structural trends and changes that are happening in Australian politics, and this is a sort of real riptide of playing out across a number of these seats. So some of the seats we're seeing, it's quite interesting, just the sheer number of candidates. So, generally in South Australia in our elections, you would tend to see perhaps 1 to 6 kind of candidates in a number of seats, sometimes fewer. But some of these seats we're seeing 8, 9, 10, 11 kind of candidates, and with some of the vote shares, it's just an absolute dolly mixture to kind of second guess what's going to happen in some of these, certainly some of these regional seats as well. And of course, for One Nation, in terms of the vote share, this is a seismic moment, and I think it is a significant marker in the sort of changing fluidity of Australian politics.
Yeah, it's Jill and I have been spending a lot of time in the last hour saying, like, how would this have played out if it was a federal election? Because the polls look quite similar, but just a little bit worse for Labor and a little bit better for the Liberal and One Nation coalition and One Nation. And so I think we would probably see a lot, like Labor are picking up a lot of seats that they wouldn't have done quite so well federally, and I think possibly federally we wouldn't know who had won at the end of the night.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's a really good question. I think Jill would be, is of course supremely well poised to answer that. And it would strike me that when I'm thinking about some of the last federal elections, maybe previous to one going back, was like particularly the rise of the Tills. The Tills, in one sense, was a recognition, I think, of the failure of the Liberal Party, or that kind of growing disjunct between the Liberal Party and metropolitan Australia. And so the Till results was I think a very early warning signal to the Liberal Party that, in one sense, it was failing to lose touch, and it was doing that on policy issues, on 2 in particular. So one was around kind of climate policy, and I think the second element was around the issue of kind of gender and gender representation. But in South Australia, something slightly different is happening, which is probably why I guess it might be harder to kind of predict a little bit more about what's going to happen, because as far as I would see and understanding, the One Nation surge in votes, where it's fracturing, is really, it's sort of playing out in some metropolitan seats, but also really showing up quite in a big way in some of those rural seats. So it's going to be quite a kind of challenge, I think, to see. I think the obvious point, I suppose, is that there's a fracturing then of the right side of politics, and it's then hard to kind of work out how preference flows might kind of see the Liberals clawing their way back to something like a more respectable state in the parliaments.
Sorry, Rob, I'm just trying to send an invite to one of the pollsters who we wanted to have join the call. But yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and I kind of say a couple of things as well. Maybe just going slightly off topic for the moment.
Please.
Just some of my kind of general reflections around the election here in South Australia, and I think there's 2 or 3 things that I think we won't find out the results for some time, but it'll be interesting to kind of see how they plan out. Firstly, I think actually one thing is a total sadness for me is that in South Australia we banned call flutes. So actually, it's been very hard to tell in certain places certainly around Adelaide, that an election is taking place. I know that many South Australians will be pleased to see the back of them. They don't like to think about politics unless they have to. But it's a real, but I think it is a real presence and kind of celebration about what's kind of going on. And I really miss that. And I think I recognise I'm in a minority. I often enjoy some of the graffiti on the call flutes, and I also I like to see how some of the MPs are aging. I think the Tom Koutsantonis one's from about like 10 years old, where he's now kind of almost completely grey. There's a sort of more serious point though, is that I think the way that we do democracy is changing, and so particularly the rise of postal voting and also early voting means that there's less of a hub around some of the polling stations in quite the same way, and that what was we celebrating our democracy sausage has gone. So my kind of that was just a general lament that we're not enjoying it in quite the same way. Maybe because I'm not as active on social media, maybe I'd get a top up somewhere else. The second point I wanted to kind of flag, I think, is what I think we won't know for some time is what the impact of the political donations ban has done on the capacity of the major parties to raise revenue. So going forward, if the overall primary vote share for the Liberals is hovering around 18-19%, actually their overall kind of funding ticket, I haven't done the calculations, is going to be a significant drop-off. And the South Australian state Liberals have relied upon one or two major donors, particularly Chinese businesswoman Sally Gu, who gave substantial donations to the Liberal Party. And I think what will be interesting, and we won't know the full effects for some time, is to see how money has flowed into the kind of election, and also how much, particularly third parties, have been kind of active. So I think that is sort of a kind of contextual thing that we don't directly engage with on election night, but I think it's worth thinking through. And then the other oddity of South Australian kind of elections is the truth in political advertising legislation. So we're kind of one of the few states that actually has legislation which is very tightly circumscribed, but often the political parties will use it to target their opponents where they perceive lies or misinformation in their kind of materials. So again, what's been a growing trend, as reported by the South Australian Election Commission, is a growth in the number of complaints or abuses of the truth in political advertising legislation. And so it's going to be, I'll expect to see another kind of uptick, and particularly with a party like One Nation really having presence here, then that's a really interesting question. So these are sort of 3 or 4 sets of kind of sort of minor or localized issues, but actually I think they do shape the way that the elections kind of playing out here in South Australia.
Because Kevin Bonham was saying earlier about like this being an interesting example of federal impact on state politics, that the One Nation surge really started at a federal level, and we only really detected it at a state level at the start of the year, right? That like last year, this was looking like a bit of a Labor was going to smash the Liberals, and that was going to be the main story. And that is definitely what's happened in some places. There are certainly a bunch of seats in Adelaide in particular that resemble WA 2017, 2021 in just like, but like One Nation largely has been driven from federal politics, but then there's all these local factors too. And it'll be interesting to see, if they get a handful of seats. Right now, they're projected to be ahead in 5, that, if they get a bunch of those, how those MPs are going to behave and how that changes the dynamic when it's not just voting for Pauline.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all good kind of points about like when did the surge go on there. I mean, I think one of the things that struck me this time out as well is that we've had far more polls in South Australia for a state election with larger samples actually than we've ever seen before, I think, than previous state elections. I mean, they tend to be quite sporadic. The Advertiser used to run a few sort of seat polls with kind of samples about 500-600. So actually, it's probably been sort of mapped a bit more closely, and it's an interesting question about when things have kind of picked up. There's obviously been some localized factors. So I think, for example, I think the rumblings around David Spears, for example, recontesting the seat of Black, would be a kind of part of this. But I think this kind of one nation kind of vote where it's kind of picking up, it probably also reflects, which I'm sure Jill might have picked up on, is that what's different about South Australia is that we don't have a Nationals Party that has anything like the presence of the other sort of states and territories. And so so the Liberal Party are kind of, they're slightly different than some of the other state branches, is that they've got slightly, they've got this kind of much sort of stronger regional, or they had this stronger regional representation, and they are now, feedback there, but there's the kind of in one sense, one nation are able to step into a political space in South Australia, which actually the Nationals would have sort of commanded. And I think they're picking up disaffected Liberals who are actually disaffected Liberal Nationals, if that kind of makes sense.
Well, we'll have George Hassanakos in a minute from Demos, who's joining us, but he'll jump in when he's ready. I've had a couple of questions as well about a few other things. It's worth noting, basically all the results we've looked at so far are for the lower house. We haven't really looked at the Legislative Council yet, where quite a few of the votes have actually come in now. One of the interesting dynamics with such a low Labor vote is that they may not be like, it's a quota of about 8.3% to win a seat. So winning 4 is about 33%. I think there was a lot of the theory that Labor would get to a 5th seat, and whether that happens or not, we're not really sure yet. But there will be a progressive majority in the upper house, definitely. There was also some people asking as well about no, maybe that was it. George, when you're ready to join us, and you want to turn on your mic, cameras up to you. It would be great to chat a little bit about what the polls have been like showing, and how they've performed tonight, and also what this will do for how we calculate preferences for federal polls. Sorry, George, we're getting a bit of feedback.
No.
While kind of maybe waiting for George to
sort
out his audio, I thought just some reflections upon the upper house and on the Legislative Council. Really, is I think you're spot on in terms of overall what I think we're expecting to see. Just to kind of confirm it, I think based on probably on that kind of Labor primary vote and where things are going, is that there will be a sort of progressive majority. So in the last state parliament, the Labor Party had to find 2 MLCs to kind of work with, and they often either went to SA Best, Connie Benares, who's up again, and or then Frank Pangello, of course, who's now contesting in a lower house seat, and they'd go to one of the Greens, either Tammy Franks, who's now standing as an independent, who probably won't get up, or Rob Sims, who's not term up. So what I think, based on that sort of numbers, is regardless if Labor pick up that 5th seat, then I still think that there's, based on then the kind of numbers, they should easily get the sort of majority to relatively pass their legislation through without having to deal with perhaps 2 One Nation and a Sarah game in there. So I think that seems to be my read about where we're at. But of course, I think some of those final spots, it's really going to be quite tricky to kind of to work through in terms of going. I think I was going to also make a kind of point about it's interesting to see how SA Best are going to kind of perform in terms of the kind of preferences, because under, they were the sort of party of Nick Xenophon, and both Frank Pangello and Connie Benares, have achieved a degree of profile. What was very interesting to me when I was looking at the ballot paper with my 13-year-old test this morning is the kind of groupings, is that there wasn't very much that you might categorize in the kind of political center on that paper. There were quite a significant number of groupings of right and center right parties, at least 7 groupings from my count. But actually there was very few in the middle, and I think the sort of most serious candidates there, which might kind of get a breakthrough, would be Stephen Polaris, the former DPP, who had significant sort of presence in a number of kind of lower house seats with candidates, and then SA Best, Connie Benares, and then her Sky Barrett, her second kind of there. So what the point I'm making is, I think in the MLC, when the preference flows there's quite a significant grouping of centre-right kind of parties, and that will be interesting to see how they kind of wash up.
Sorry, we're having a little bit of trouble working out George's audio, but maybe we might just try, George, if I just ask you a question, then unmute you and see how that goes. I'm interested in your thoughts on both how the polls have performed, but also the extra data you think you'll get out of this that might help with all the federal polls that have been so difficult to kind of work out what you do about things like preferences. If you want to unmute, yeah, go for it.
Look, I think the polls have gone pretty well, especially those done by Internet Panel. With Internet Panel, I do think it's the best methodology we have at the moment, most cost-efficient methodology as well. But there's always a concern that, there are people who, you're just getting people who are willing to answer surveys. And so hence at some point you might miss out on the people who don't want to engage in surveys. But at this point in time, it seems like the polls done by Internet Panels have done relatively well, especially given the big change from the Liberals to One Nation. But yes, preference data. Oh, we're hanging out for the preference data. Sure are. Because, look, there has been a big shift, as we've seen tonight. There's a lot of new One Nation voters, and many of them come from the Liberals, but not all have. And also, what's left with the Liberal voters? What is their preference behaviour? Now, we're not going to get that in full detail tonight. But when the Electoral Commission does their counts and various psephologists will go through the data, we will find out what the preference flows will be. And I'm, as a pollster, I'm definitely hanging out for that.
Thanks, George. Yeah, it's I feel like we're getting a little bit close to the end for tonight, because we are going to get some pre-polls a bit later. They're going to come in pretty late, and I think we'll probably put up a blog post in the morning about like where things have landed. But I think we're going to I think probably where we're at is I'd like to go through what those seats are that haven't been decided. There's a bunch of them. Most of them, though, haven't been decided, not because they're conventionally close, but because we don't know who's made the top 2, or we don't have preferences. So we might run through some of those and kind of get a bit of a sense of the lay of the land and of where the seat count's going to end up. But do either of you, and I'm happy to run through, there's about 15 seats I want to look at. I'm happy to run through them all. But do either of you have any other thoughts you want to jump in about before we go through that? And then we might think about wrapping up. It's about 9:45 now in SA.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I thought I might jump in with just a kind of few thoughts, observations, and watching some of the ABC coverage tonight. Certainly, my apologies for not having total loyalty to listening to the tally room all night. But there was a really interesting exchange between Anne Rushton, the moderate Liberal senator, and then Nick McBride. Nick McBride, of course, is running in the seat of McKillop. He's a former Liberal who's running as a independent, one of the state's wealthiest men, of course, and he's currently wearing an ankle bracelet because he's facing, where he was kind of allegations of domestic violence charges, and he's running as an independent in that seat. And the question here, the fundamental kind of question about Australian politics, kind of played out in their exchange, because the Liberal result here, let's not kind of sugarcoat it, is just absolutely devastating. They're down to what, about 18% primary vote, and there is just a complete fracturing now on the right. And Nick McBride was saying that actually the Liberals have far more in common with One Nation. And in one sense, if you take the view that the bulk of the One Nation voters were perhaps former Liberals or more Liberal inclined, then that shores up the kind of McBride argument. So that would say, okay, well then to win them back, then probably the Liberals have to go One Nation light, or they need to kind of find a way to get into that Conservative heartland basis. But the electoral logic say something quite different, is that to win seats, and you're looking at all the seats that now have were formerly strong Liberal, living in, for example, I live in the seat of Unley, for example, which is now a Labour seat, which is quite incredible, or a seat like Davenport, which was won by Labour in the last election, but now is a solid Labour kind of seat, is that actually, Anne Rushton was arguing, saying that actually we don't have much in common, we want to assert Liberal values. And I'm not necessarily sure that an Angus Taylor-led Liberal Party is really prepared to engage in that existential question as thoroughly probably as it needs to be done. I think there's a sort of bit of denial. I read the party review of the Liberal Party of the last federal election, and it strikes me that I think there's still some element of denial about what is happening in terms of what I would see to be a greater kind of fragmentation and fluidity in Australian politics. And what we're seeing tonight, and certainly in that exchange, is an existential dilemma for them. And there's an excellent book by Tim Bale and Cal Vassar on the crisis of the right across many kind of Western European countries. And this is exactly the fault line. So Australia is actually coming late to this party and kind of trend. So it's kind of just some general reflections there about the dilemmas, the strategic dilemmas for the Liberals moving forward.
Yeah, I'm not sure the Liberals have a choice. Like, I feel like there's people in the Liberal Party who can't stand One Nation, but I think that I was really fascinated by the way they dealt with preferences in this election, that they came out quite early and were like, don't let them tell you anything else. We're preferencing One Nation. Like, we have picked our side. And it was completely the opposite of what happened with John Howard in the 90s, where he, that happened after the 98 Queensland election, which admittedly was an election where the coalition was devastated and One Nation won a bunch of seats. But I think if they're trying to hold on to those voters who are flirting with One Nation, it's very hard to do that while holding, like, the saying we won't work with them, they're outside the pale. So yeah, George, do you have sorry, go
so I was just saying, just the quick response was that, I think I've seen it both Labour and Liberal this election, is that there's usually a distinction made between One Nation party elites and then One Nation supporters. And I think Peter Malinauskas, for example, has been quite, certainly in the last week or so, where I think it's really dawned on them just how strong this One Nation surge has been, to not offend in quite sort of categorical terms people who are supporting One Nation. But it's a good point. Sorry, Ben, I was interrupting.
That's all right. I just, George, I was wondering, do you have any other thoughts that you wanted to jump in about, like, what's going on here? Hang on, let me unmute you. Sorry. There you go.
There we go. So Rob makes a very good point about, One Nation being, are they part of the broader conservative movement or not? And I too watched that exchange with the fellow in McKillop, and he was very passionate that One Nations and the Liberals should work together. But look, what's interesting is this is seen as earth-shattering, but really the Liberals and the coalition generally, ever since the 2022 election, they've had this choice on how to get back into power federally. And that is, do you go back into the inner city seats that you lost with the Teals? Or do you try and find more lower socioeconomic electorates on the fringes of the capital cities, like Blair, like Werriwa, like Hawke, and go after those, because you're not going to get the Teals back again. And it sinks in with what's happening around the world, where parties of the centre-left are doing better in metropolitan areas, and parties of the centre-right to right are doing better outside of the metropolitan areas. You're seeing this realignment. This realignment could have still happened even if One Nation hadn't come up. It could have been the Liberals that have done that. But because we've seen One Nation come up, and they've done very well in Northern Adelaide tonight, Taylor and Light, and to an extent in some other seats. And that sinks in with what our MRP shows, that One Nation are a chance in places like Hawke in Victoria, that, they can win in outer metropolitan areas, which previously has been seen as relatively solid Labor. But you see all these interplaying factors, but because of the weakness in Conservative leadership at the moment, One Nation has seized that opportunity, and it's more painful than it otherwise would have been, but the same factors that the Liberal Party had to deal with post-2022, this rupture in the right is making that choice for them, it seems.
Well, Ben, we love. But just to say, I think George, you make a good point. I think there's something here about leadership as well, around how the party, both federally and certainly at the state level, would pick through this. It's they would have to be looking at some of these similar results where a party gets obliterated, wiped out, and then say, well, look, how do you kind of come back? Can the tide turn? Do you sort of, some of it will be people get tired of a government after a period of time. They kind of, the policy will start coming off a little bit. The sheen comes off. In fact, we're seeing the sheen come off a little bit off the Malinowskis government just in the last few weeks. So it's, they're kind of picking up, but they still need a kind of a smart strategy. And what strikes me again is just that the Labour Party in South Australia are a formidable electoral machine. They really are across the numbers, the booths, the depth of knowledge there. In one sense, I just don't think that the Liberal Party has ever really quite managed to kind of dominate in quite the same way. So it'll be, it'd be fascinating to see how they regroup, how they regather, and what's left. I think the only other observation I've got there would be one of the problems with the Liberal Party here in South Australia is that factionally they had been controlled, or the Conservatives had got a kind of dominance in some of the machinery, but some of the moderates overrepresented some of the seats. I think the caucus will look a little bit different again, and this kind of question about will they be, in some senses, have they got any kind of inner city seats? They've got, I think Jack Batty looks like the only sort of metropolitan MP. So in one sense, they're not, they don't have a kind of strong voice for certain types of electorates, which was always sort of David Spears, the former Liberal leader's appeal, was that he could speak to a constituency that kind of blue ribbon Liberals couldn't kind of reach. It's a good question. Ben, did you want to take us through some seats?
We might run through, not a full call of the board, but there's 14 seats that I think are interesting to watch. And I'm going to be doing a blog post for the morning. There'll be some maps in that as well, but I won't try and squeeze those maps in while doing the live blog. And of course, we're going to get a bunch of pre-poll votes later tonight, so we'll include those as well in the morning. Yes. So what we're going to do is run through a couple of things. One is the combinations of parties that are competing with each other in particular seats. There are about a third of the state, 16 out of 47 seats, are complex. We don't know who's in the 2CP. Quite a few of those are seats where Labor is way out in front. And then there's, we don't know who's coming second, but it's not really relevant for the result. But there's a handful which we'll get into where it is really relevant. And we probably would need a 3CP or even a 4CP. But more realistically, we're probably going to have to wait for the distribution of preferences. There's also 18 seats which are Labor versus One Nation. That is over a third of the state. There is only 7 seats that are clearly Labor versus Liberal. So 7 out of 47, we're talking like a seventh of the state, an eighth, not quite an eighth, but about a seventh of the state, which are still classic seats. There will be a few of those 16 that end up in that category too. There's only 4 seats which are Liberal versus One Nation. And then there are 2 that are Independent versus One Nation, thing that we've only seen once before in 2001 in Queensland. Only in about 11 seats do we have the right 2-candidate preferred. There's a bunch of seats where we don't know the correct 2-candidate preferred, and they will have to do that count. I'm not sure when that'll come. I'll have to send an email to EXA asking them about that. Okay, so the 14 seats. There are only 2 that I judge as being conventionally close, as in we have the preference count, we know who the top 2 are, and we don't know who's going to win. The first of them is Bragg. Right now, the Liberal is on 53.3% over Labor. They are likely to win. Williams' website has calculated it, but we don't have any pre-poll votes yet. So probably Bragg is going to stay with the Liberal Party, but I would like to see a bit more of the result before I call that. The other one is Morphett, where Williams' website has called it for Labor. They're on 54.1%, but again, there's no pre-poll. Not a single pre-poll vote, not a postal vote has been counted. I wouldn't want to call that quite yet as certain. Then we have 6 seats where I'm just sorting my list to make sure I go through them in the right order. We have 6 seats where 7 seats where we know who the top 2 are, and they've counted the wrong ones. So hopefully early next week, these seats, they will do a correct count, and a lot of these seats will get called. In Elizabeth, Labor is leading 41.4 to 32.8 for One Nation, but they have done a Labor versus Liberal count. Likely this will go to Labor. We then have Hammond. Hammond is a seat that looked more interesting earlier. I think probably the sitting MP, the Liberal, is out of the race, as is Airlie Keane, the Independent, and this is actually a Labor versus One Nation contest. I think at the moment it looks like One Nation is more likely to win on Liberal preferences, but it hasn't been called. We have Light, which looks likely to go to Labor, but One Nation, it's 38% to Labor, 32% to One Nation. Again, a lot of these are Light and Elizabeth are both on the northern outskirts of Adelaide, and then we go to the southern outskirts of Adelaide. Labor is on 37, One Nation's on 26. I think this has probably been won by Labor, but I would like to see a preference count to be sure. We've then got Mount Gambier, which is One Nation versus an Independent, but neither of them have cleared 30%. There are a lot of preferences to be counted. The Independent wins very comfortably against the Liberal, so I think they will win comfortably against One Nation too, but I would like to see that preference count. Sorry, Naranga without an S. One Nation has a substantial lead over the Liberal in this seat, but probably the Labor preferences are not going to be favourable to them. I think this is probably a One Nation win, but I'd like to see the preference flow. And Stewart, which is Jeff Brock's seat, he has a 6.5 point lead over One Nation. He's, I think, probably won this seat, but I would like to see a preference count. Then we have 5 seats, and this is
sorry to interrupt. Just 2 seconds, Ben. So just going off vibes and the limited information, are we thinking then that One Nation have got sort of a realistic chance in at least 2 lower house seats. Narungga was one, wasn't it? I think. Is
Yeah, I haven't
your
locked
sense
any.
about where they might
Yeah.
go?
I have them leading in Narungga and leading in Hammond.
Yeah.
William Bowe has them leading in 4. So he's also got them leading in MacKillop, which we'll get to in a minute. I also have them leading in MacKillop and Nadgery, but we will get to those in a minute. So right now they're leading in 4. There's a couple of others that could still be interesting for them. I wouldn't say 4 is the absolute ceiling, but there's 4 where they're looking reasonably good. But yeah, there's 5 more seats we haven't gotten to, and at least 2 of them. William has One Nation leading in 2. I have them leading in 1, but honestly, like that, they're competitive. So those 5 seats, these are all seats where we don't know who the top 2 are, and there's some genuine, serious doubt about who the top 2 are, and we can't call it without that information. 4 of these 5 seats, the 3CP would resolve that issue like the AEC now does. I don't know if EXA would consider doing that. I'll need to contact them. The 5th one is Carvel, where that would probably not be enough to resolve it. So if we run through these, the first one is Hyson. And again, Hyson is an unusual seat in that One Nation's nowhere to be seen here. They've come 4th with 14%. But Labor and the Greens are in a close contest for 2nd. Labor, on the 2PP that the EXA is counting, Labor is narrowly ahead of the Liberal Party. But if the Greens overtake Labor, and we don't know how those One Nation preferences are going to flow, then the Greens would also have a good chance of winning. This is a seat like Ryan, like Pran in the past, where Labor and Greens are in a close race for 2nd, and whoever wins might beat the Liberal Party. So the Greens have a chance of winning here.
The local colour there, of course, is Josh Teague, the Liberal candidate, is of course long-standing moderate kind of member, long-standing kind of Liberal family, of course, son of Baden Teague, and Josh Teague, deputy leader, moderate wing of the party, very affable, very well liked, and kind of respected. But actually, this would be, it's interesting here. I think where I think would be a generally well liked, well regarded, kind of moderate Liberal with quite a lot of support in the area. Is just suffering here on the kind of the riptide of backlash against the Liberal Party. That to me is a really interesting part of that story.
Absolutely. Okay, so these five seats, we got Hyson, sorry, and then we have Finnis. Now, the next 3 or the next 4, One Nation is an interesting factor in these seats. So in Finnis, we have Liberal on 24, we have One Nation on 23, we have 21% for Lou Nicholson, the independent. We do not have any postal votes, any pre-poll votes being counted yet. If Nicholson can get into the top 2, I think she has a very good chance of winning. There's an 18% Labor vote. She is winning the 2PP against the Liberal very comfortably, 58%. If One Nation was out of the race here, we would have called this for her. But the problem she has now is, can she get into the top 2? There is a lot of Labor votes there, and I think that will favour her. And so I think she does have a good chance of winning Finnis, to the point where I'm actually going to say I think there's actually an independent leading seat, even though she's currently in 3rd place. I think she could quite realistically come from 3rd and win that seat. And if it is One Nation she's overtaking, we know that she's probably won the seat.
Ben, can I ask a quick question about pre-poll and postals? In the past, when certainly postal voting was less significant statistically, we could often sometimes make assumptions that actually it tends to be older voters and more right-inclined voters would sweep through. So we could sort of make a guess that on the night marginal seats, you might see a wash through of, say, more Liberal or National. Can we make any of those sorts of kind of assumptions now when we're looking at, you're rightly pointing out we don't have pre-polls or postals for a lot of seats. is there any assumptions we can make about what we think the complexion of those might look like?
Yeah, I'm going to say something quickly, and then George, if you want to jump in. I think we will have a lot more data when this election's over, but right now we don't really know, because I think generally major parties do better, but it's also true that older, more conservative voters tend to be more concentrated in those groups. So which of those tropes applies to One Nation, I'm not really sure. Possibly they cancel each other out. George?
Yeah, look, I was just wanting to back you in. I agree. I think Lou Nicholson will make the final count here. Because it's almost like the electorate's been divided up into quarters between Basham for Liberal, Powerful One Nation, Nicholson is independent, and then you throw in Labor and the Greens. And if I recall correctly, looking at the how to votes registered with the Commission, the Greens have Lou Nicholson above Labor, so there's no chance that Lou Nicholson will be jumped over either. So, as far as I'm concerned, I think she should make the final count, unless pre-poll has some sort of crazy difference. Yeah. Of course, that is still to come.
The thing that was, I think it's right to say, is that the last state election, Lou Nicholson, I think, won the count on the night, but lost on postals. So she's got a lot of recognition within the state and done a lot of that kind of door knocking in a sort of kind of voices of style approach to kind of campaigning there. So if that does come through, I wouldn't be surprised by that.
I'll just make one other comment here. Another interesting factor here is Bron Lewis, the other independent, and she ran her own independent style campaign. I guess you could say it was kind of like Voices. And I was just very interested because she was, in a way, pitting herself against Nicholson. And she hasn't seemed to have performed that well. Now, without any local knowledge, I can't say why. But I just thought it was interesting. In fact, in the seats where independents did well, but didn't get there, there has been another independent. I think Airlie Keane had a challenger too in Hammond, which hasn't performed well. In parts because One Nation has been a big factor in an election. Like, it's a ready-made place to put a anti-major party vote.
Okay, let's keep moving through. Nadri, we have again most of the election day vote. Probably this is a One Nation versus Liberal contest, but you would assume like Labor will get preferences from the Greens and maybe some legalised cannabis and animal justice. There's about 8% in minor left there that could help the Greens as help Labor. If they get into the top two, then obviously probably whoever they're up against will win. If it's Liberal versus Labor, Liberal will win comfortably. I suspect One Nation would win comfortably against Labor. Liberal versus One Nation, genuinely, we don't really know. So, Nadjeri looking very close and really up in the air.
I must confess, this was one of my top gains for One Nation. Like, if One Nation was going to win seats, they were going to win here because, to my mind, they really needed the Liberals to come third in a seat to get their preferences to win. And there was no intervening independent, so I'm not surprised that if One Nation do go on to win this seat.
Yeah, and the addition of pre-polls could change things, but right now Liberal is ahead of One Nation, so One Nation seems a little bit more vulnerable to falling into third. But
this was the seat, of course, that got under the redistribution. Was kind of caused the sort of ructions in terms of the change to geography because Tony Piccolo was a member for Light. Jumped across, so you have actually sort of two sitting MPs sort of going head to head here, which is so there's that sort of boundary change as well, which has sort of made this a fascinating site. This one is the one to watch. I think about One Nation. I totally agree with that, George. It was on the dashboard.
And then second last one, McKillop. One Nation has a substantial lead here. And so I think they are probably the favourites to win. But McBride has fallen further behind the Liberal. I think it's possible we might end up saying we think this is going to be a One Nation Liberal contest and McBride is out of the 2CP. this has changed a little bit since last I looked at it, but the vote count is also very slow here. I'm not sure what's going on, but there's only 5 booths reported. So McKillop actually, there's a lot more to come here. And looking at the booth count, I think McKillop just is weirdly early in the count.
That would be the slowness, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there, McKillop, very regional seat. I think some of those polling booths will be in quite disparate locations.
Yeah.
I think that would be one of the factors, presumably.
And then the last seat of the night, Carville, a seat that we talked about on the podcast this week. Josh Sunman was saying as a local was one to watch. Labor is leading on 24% of the vote. There are 5 candidates polling over 10% right now. We have most of the election day vote is in, but we don't have any pre-polls yet. That will change things up a lot. Maybe it will become clear who the top 3 or even the top 2 are. But right now, I think this is a result that can't be determined for sure until a full preference distribution. But I would also say that if he can stay in the top count, Matt Schultz is probably the favourite because I think he will do better against any opponent. Like he probably will benefit from preferences if he's up against Labor or One Nation. But right now, he's only 1% ahead of One Nation. So you've also got to consider the possibility that he might drop into third and miss out.
Matt Schultz is the candidate there who's got the sponsorship of Dan Cregan, the outgoing independent former Liberal. It's
and
like
Rebecca Sharkey.
Yeah, and so I've got just 2 very quick comments here. One is, when you're thinking about what do we take out of South Australia and apply to the federal context, would you say, do you look at a seat like this to say, look, there's now there really is a fracturing of the vote share, and you would sort of say yes to a certain extent, particularly with the One Nation thing. So it's playing out here quite. But then you'd say, actually, there's something quite specific about South Australia because Dan Cregan, the former MP, was Speaker of the House, was expected to be actually a leader of the Liberal Party, but couldn't hack it anymore and went independent. So you would say, well, how much is that also playing out in the federal Liberal Party? And so maybe there's something specifically about the dysfunction of the South Australian Liberals which you wouldn't want to read too much across to say, okay, look at Prevail to say on the federal picture.
And with that, I think we're probably going to wrap up. Thanks, George and Rob, for joining me, and thank you to Jill and Anthony and Josh and Kevin, who all joined earlier tonight. Much appreciated everyone's involvement and everyone participating. We've had about 400 people on recently, and I think it was about 500 earlier. Everyone in the comments, well, some of you in the comments, and really contributing and helping us find some interesting stories. I'll be back tomorrow with a blog post kind of summing up where things are at. I'll probably wait until the morning to finish writing it. And if you do appreciate the work that I've been doing with the Tally Room, one thing you can consider is there's a Tally Room Patreon, which you can sign up for. It's $8 a month plus GST, and there's a Discord where people talk about elections, and check that out. And we will hope to do another one of these for the Farrer by-election in May, so please keep an eye out for that. Rob and George, do you have any last comments before we wrap up?
Actually, look, one comment. These complex counts, for people like us, we love them. It's interesting to pick the eyes out of them. But going forward, does this add to confusion about preferential voting? It's something I think that we should ponder in the future, and something electoral commissions should think about innovative ways about trying to report who has won on election night.
Sorry, Rob, you're muted.
I suppose the debate I've had with a number of colleagues in sort of political science is like, is this One Nation vote here to stay? And I'm pretty much in the ledge. I think it is. I think we're moving towards more like a Sweden situation. I still think there will be a couple of election cycles before the seat count really picks up for One Nation. But I think this is a force now, which is certainly bigger than Pauline Hanson. But I think this is the the debate. I think some of us might be wishing it away, but I think actually, I think Sweden is an interesting kind of example of where a radical right populist party sort of has broken through.
Yeah, well, we will see at Farah in May that'll be the next big electoral test for One Nation, and it'll be interesting to see. So thank you everyone for joining me, and it's 10:18 in South Australia, and sleep well everyone, because it's going to be a few weeks before we really know everything that's going to happen with this election. Have a good night, everyone.